The next page of the N64 mag here. Blimey, September 99 already. Where did the summer go? Right, so it's the usual mashup of stuff. Looks like they've got reviews of a bunch of games. WWF Attitude is in there, apparently the best wrestler yet. Crikey, they say that every year, don't they? Then there's F1 World Grand Prix 2. Fantastic first tips, which probably means how to avoid spinning out on the first corner. World Driver gets a first ever review and is called a stunner. Let's see about that. Quake 2 is also reviewed with Essential Playing Guide in tow, because everyone got stuck on that bloody base level with the Strog things. Big news is the world's first review of Shadow Man, and it's being called Summer's Biggest Game. They're laying it on thick, aren't they? 10 whole pages on it, apparently grisly. Sounds right up my street, to be honest. Looks like a spooky bloke with glowing eyes on the cover. Bit dramatic. Then there's the P+ section, with latest news and pics on Donkey Kong 64, Perfect Dark, Jet Force Gemini, and WCW Mayhem. All the big hitters for Christmas then, must be getting the hype train rolling early. And a Planet Game Boy section too. The old brick still kicking about then, eh? Oh, and a free double game guide apparently if you lift up the page. Sneaky. And a mention of Resident Evil 2, with 41 spine-chilling new shots. More zombies then, can't have too many zombies really. Yep, standard issue really. Bit of everything for the N64 fan. This page of N64 Magazine, issue 32 from September 1999, looks like the opening editorial from Tim Weaver. He's right there with a goofy picture, asking if he looks scary, probably a lead into some horror game review, Resident Evil 2 maybe? He's banging on about how it's a massive 140-page issue, Britain's biggest and best-selling Nintendo mag. Fair play to them. They reckon they get all the scoops and don't just copy stuff off the internet, which was a big deal back then, before everyone had broadband. Seems like they've got 4-star game reviews this month, including 2 exclusives. Shadow Man's the big one, a Zelda-like game, apparently with an evil glint in its eye, and snazzy line in jeans, whatever that means. Probably marketing waffle. But yeah, Shadow Man was a bit of a dark horse, looked quite interesting at the time. They've also got Resident Evil 2 covered, 41 all-new shots from Capcom's forthcoming Scarefest. Bet that was exciting for fans. Resi 2 was a massive deal on the PlayStation, everyone was waiting for it on the 64. He mentions Duke Nukem, 0 Hour and Trump World. Must be typos there. Probably meant Top Trump World. Oh wait, no, Duke Nukem 0 Hour, yeah, that was coming to the 64 too. And seems Mark Green has joined the team, good for him. New. Down at the bottom, they are plugging a few other games they've reviewed this month. WWF Attitude, F1 WGP2, World Driver Championship, and Quake 2. Quake 2 rated. Plus walkthroughs for the first 3 levels that's handy. They've got a little globe character playing a 64 controller. Looks a bit cheesy but inoffensive. Gigi. Next issue is out on Monday the 6th of September, and apparently it's going to be a fantastic jump to page 136. Whatever is on page 136 must be good then. And yeah, look out for this little chap the Globe on N64 covers every month. All sounds like standard mag stuff really, plugging the content and trying to get you hyped for the next issue. This page of the magazine, right, it's the contents page for issue 32 from September 1999. Looking back, it's a proper snapshot of what we were buzzing about on the N64 back then. Warrington Norcree. Up top we've got Planet 64 Inches kicking things off, covering the news, and there's talk about Dolphing. That was the code name for the GameCube, wasn't it? They mentioned Shadow Man, and a cheat code for Rogue Squadron. Always handy. Then a coming soon section shows off Perfect Dark, that bomb beater they were all banging on about, plus WCW Mayhem, some wrestling game, and Donkey Kong 64. Over on the right, N64 Arena is where they review the games. Shadow Man again, they're calling it Zelda's evil twin. Bit dramatic, but alright. World Driver Championship, trying to be the next big racing game like GT64 maybe. Then WWF Attitude for the wrestling fans. Quake 2 for some multiplayer blasting. F1 World GP2, another F1 game, can't have too many of those, can you? And Command & Conquer making its way to the N64. Strategy games on console, those were the days. Down at the bottom there's Import Arena for the Japanese and American games, with Pokemon Stadium 2 getting a look in. And yeah, the usual regular bits are there. Information Station, N64 Shopper, a preview for the next issue, and even Planet Game Boy for the handheld stuff. 8 pages of Game Boy news and reviews apparently. Those jam-packed pages, as they say. Good times. This page of the magazine. Right then, let's have a look. It's all about what's coming up on the N64. Future Look it's calling it. Right on the front of the contents page, page 6 for that. Warren. So what have we got? Jet Force Gemini, yeah, that was rare back in the day, wasn't it? Exclusive never before seen screenshots it boasts. Alright, calm down. Sprocket is there too. Ace-looking platformer. We'll see about that. Then there's Shadow Man, which they're calling the N64's darkest game to date. Bit dramatic, aren't we? Says it's got 10 gruesome pages on page 46, good for them. And blimey, Resident Evil 2 is getting a proper special investigation. Capcom's zombie shooter ripping open its guts, apparently. Page 30 for that, if you're into that sort of thing. Below that we've got How to Burn It Up Sebulba style in Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, page 90. Everyone was buzzing for Episode 1 back then, weren't they? Even if the film turned out a bit gay. F1 World Grand Prix 2 is in there too for the racing fans, page 96. Then it's your regular magazine bits. Club 64 mailbox. Big Tim Weaver looking at letters on page 84. Tips extra covering World Driver, Superman, Shadowgate, and more. Bit of a mixed bag of games there. Dr. Kit's Game Clinic, page 105. For your gaming ailments, the Kitster doles out more medicine, it says. Righto. Nintendo Hotline with their minty gaming knowledge, page 106. Classic. Game On with quirky game challenges, page 108. I'm the best chance to be well. The best bit cheesy that, page 110. And Skill Club 64 feet now with brand new Platinum Club, page 114. Whatever that is. Contact Directory for pen pals and game swapping, page 118. And a directory of every single N64 game ever made, right here, page 120, might be useful for completists, back issues and subscriptions, so you never be late again with N64 Magazine, page 130. And right at the bottom, roll the credits, tracking down the talented people behind your favorite games, page 132. A bit worthy that. September 1999, says at the bottom. Seems like a decent enough issue, covering the big hitters and the usual magazine stuff. This page from the N64 magazine is taking a future look, as they call it, at some upcoming N64 games. The big one they are pushing is Jet Force Gemini. As you can probably guess from the massive logo, they've got a bunch of screenshots showing off what Rare's Bug Blaster is all about. Looks like your typical 3D shooter from the time, but with Velia alien blood reflecting on the floor, which is apparently incredible. Lupus, that's the dog chap, is collecting health bonuses it seems, and there's talk of shooting bears, even enslaved ones in diamond mines. Charming. Apparently, lobbing grenades down a big beast's throat is the way to go in another section, good to know. They also point out the bigger weapons have a decent blast radius, useful if your aim is a bit off, which mine usually was back then to be fair, and seemingly the bugs like to duck behind crates, crafty little blighters. There's an info burst box with all the nerdy details for Jet Force Gemini, like it's coming from Rare, naturally, and it's a 256 megabit cart, which was pretty chunky for the time. 1 to 4 players, memory pack and rumble pack support, all standard stuff. Release dates are down for September in the US, October here in the UK, and TBA for Japan. They've whacked 5 red blobs on the anticipation rating, so they were clearly rather keen. The write-up goes on about how they redesigned the characters to be more grown-up, and how the violence makes more sense now. Right then, they saw a bit of it at E3, and were surprised by how big it all is. Sounds like they're trying to make it sound epic, doesn't it? Oh, and right at the bottom, a tiny mention for Sprocket from Ubisoft, calling it a colourful new platformer. Doesn't get much love compared to Gemini though, does it? And a little nudge to check out the coming soon section on page 18 for more new games. That's your lot for this page really. This page is all about Jet Force Gemini, which was a game folks were pretty hyped for back in '99. It's doing the sibling rivalry thing with the characters, showing off Juno, Vela, Lupus the dog, and Floyd who's like a Navitype support bot. They've got these little boxes describing each character, with screenshots. Juno's the tough one, Vela's the sister who can swim, Lupus is a rocket-powered dog that turns into a tank boat, and Floyd's this hovering thing that warns you about danger. Someone at Rare clearly had a wild imagination. The main bit of text talks about the game having 10 worlds, loads of sublevels, and you play as Juno, Vela and Lupus, starting from different parts of the map and meeting up later. Visually, they're making a big deal about reflective surfaces, real-time shadows, and weather effects all running without slowdown, which was pretty impressive for the N64 days. Apparently the music's good too, Dolby surround sound and all that jazz. They're calling it a technical masterpiece. Bit strong perhaps, but we'll see. Gameplay-wise, they reckon it's a mix of old-school shooters and 3D adventures, like Banjo-Kazooie with guns and more gore. Control sounds a bit fiddly, using the joystick and C buttons for strafing and jumping, but they say you get used to it. Apparently you can rescue these tribals, or just blow them up, which is a bit dark. In it, environments go from jungles to alien bases, rocket packs, hoverbikes, loads of weapons, typical Rare ambition really. They think it could be one of the biggest games of the year, but they'll know for sure in a couple of months. Always good to see what Rare ambition are cooking up, they usually delivered. This page has got a bit of a dark sense of humor to kick things off, talking about Care Bears that you just don't care about, and it's clear they're having a laugh about the violence in games. It's previewing some game where you can blow up these furry little blokes, and they'll be pasted all over the walls apparently. You can even decapitate them and collect their heads. Charming stuff. They mention using sniper rifles on them too as they waddle towards you. Sounds a bit brutal for a Nintendo game, but hey, times were changing. Then there's a section called Jet Forers, and it's all about multiplayer in Jet Force Gemini. Apparently the 4-player battle mode is where you'll spend most of your time. They reckon the arenas are good, plenty of places to hide and snipe. Classic stuff. You can play as Lupus, the dog bloke, and they joke about him being good, because he's always getting shot. Typical. There's also a target shooting mode, a bit like a playable version of Knife Edge, which was that training bit in GoldenEye, everyone loved that. And there's racing games too. They mention the arenas look good, no fog which was always a bonus back then, and pressing R flips the camera around. Simple but useful. And they point out the radar, saying maybe there's a cheat to turn it off, which was always the dream, wasn't it? No radar for proper sneaky play. Seems like they're saying it'll be a good laugh with your mates, plenty of ways to play, and keep you busy. This page then, it's all about Jet Force Gemini, as you can probably guess from the massive title splashed across the top. It looks like they're showing off the game's alien nightclub level, Big Bug Fun Club. Apparently you can go in disguised as an ant, which is a bit of a laugh. They reckon you can even request tunes from the DJ and play some mini arcade games, like Jeff and Barry Racing, which they say is basically Super Sprint. Sounds like a bit of fun I suppose if you're into that kind of thing. Hey me. Then there's a section called Take No Prisoners, talking about the enemy AI in Jet Force Gemini. Apparently they are quite clever, hiding behind stuff and being scared of explosions and all that. They even surrender sometimes, begging for mercy, but the reviewer is having none of it, calling it a mercy-free zone. Bit harsh maybe. The screenshots show some shooting action, and some flying alien blokes getting blown up. All looks pretty standard for a shooter really. Finally at the bottom it mentions a massive review coming up in the next issue, N64 number 34. So, looks like they're building up the hype for Jet Force Gemini, which was a pretty big deal back then if I remember rightly. This page is all about a new platformer called Sprock from Ubisoft. Looks a bit bonkers, doesn't it? It's got that sort of wacky, colourful vibe that was all the rage back then. They're showing off some screenshots, and it's got a bit of everything: roller coasters, some weird looking characters, and they even mention paintballing in the levels, which sounds a bit different. The reviewer seems to be pointing out some of the oddities, like a blue face and a bloke in a toga, with a bit of a chuckle. The infoburst box tells us it's a 128 megabit cart, just one player, and rumble pack support, naturally. Memory pack is in there too. They're saying it's coming out in December in the UK, but TBA in Japan. Looks like they're pretty keen on it. Judging by the anticipation rating for Red Blobs, not bad at all. Seems like they were hoping for another wacky platformer to keep us entertained over Christmas. The next page gives us a future look at a game called Sprocket for the N64. It seems like they're trying to pitch it as a bit of a mashup, saying imagine Glover, Banjo-Kazooie and even Uniracers all thrown together. Sounds a bit ambitious, doesn't it? They're going on about this ultra-realistic physics engine and bizarre vehicles, which back then was all the rage, wasn't it? Physics engines were the next big thing. Sprocket himself is this little limbless droid on a unicycle. Apparently he's all about bouncing around in a 3D platforming world. The main thing they're pushing is how you can mess about with everything in the levels. Apparently every object has weight and reacts properly, which, again, physics engine, in it, you can pick stuff up, throw it around, and it behaves like you'd expect in real life. To make up for having no arms, he's got a tractor beam on his head, which sounds a bit daft but handy for lifting things. They mention painting, driving, even jumping in a paintball tank to color the world in pastel shades. Bit weird that. Apparently there are color-based puzzles, so it's not just random daftness. It's set in an amusement park called Whoopee World, with 7 massive levels. One level even involves building a roller coaster. Collecting bolts is a thing too, and they like to burrow into soft things apparently. The reviewer reckons it's aiming to be a bit different from your average platformer, and maybe more original than most games since Glover. Bit of a bold claim there, let's be honest. They're saying it's out later this year, hopefully not getting overshadowed by Body Harvest and Zelda. We'll see, won't we? To be continued, it says. So looks like they'll be back with more on Sprocket next month. Oh yes. This page is from Planet N64 News Desk, and it's all about the rumors and info about Nintendo's next console, which at the time they were calling Dolphin. It's all very hush-hush, but the mag reckons development kits are already with some developers, and this new machine is supposed to be a real step up from the PlayStation 2, both in power and price. Apparently it's going to use DVD tech from Matsushita, which is interesting as the N64 was still on cartridges, and they reckon you could fit loads of Zelda games on one disc without any compression, which sounds amazing at the time. Imagine no more cartridge swaps. They mentioned that the codename Dolphin might be dropped, which is a bit of a shame. Dolphin sounded quite cool. The big names in Japanese game development like Namco, Capcom, Konami, Square and Hudson have all apparently been invited to get on board, though some like Square are being a bit cagey until they see proper development kits, maybe still burned from the N64 days and the cost of carts. There's even a bit of rumor mill stuff about Square possibly being in bed with Sony due to the whole Final Fantasy thing. Drama as always. It also touches on the fact that Nintendo isn't aiming for movie playback, they are sticking to games. Fair enough, I suppose. They reckon the console will be affordable, around $100 to $200, which would be good, though that's dollars, so probably more in pounds. There's a picture of Mario, of course, and what looks like a screenshot of Zelda on a disc, and a tiny little chip which is apparently the IB Magecko processor. Sounds a bit like something out of Thunderbirds, doesn't it? It's all very exciting at the time, thinking about what the next Nintendo console will be like, especially after the N64. You were always wondering what amazing games they would come up with next. This page, right, it's a proper blast from the past, innit? Looking at the shortcuts section, they're talking about Superman and Robocop games coming to the N64. Remember all that hype for Superman 64? What a disaster that turned out to be. They mentioned Beetle Adventure Racing as well. Seems like they confused readers with a joke about a Beatles-themed game. Smash Bros Fights Back. Well, they were banging on about wanting Smash Bros in the UK, and it sounds like they finally got their way, but we had to wait till December for the pale release. Typical. Down in Dead Certs, it's all about who's developing for the next Nintendo console, the GameCube. Apparently, Namco and Square were being a bit awkward about it, while everyone else was jumping on board. They're predicting a Super Mario 64 sequel, and a Metroid game based on the Zelda engine, which is interesting. Then there's chat about Rare doing a Mickey Mouse game, and Killer Instinct 3, which might be arcade perfect. And of course Perfect Dark was getting rave reviews, so a sequel was a given, wasn't it? No. Factor 5 Inches is about Turrican, that old Amiga shoot-'em-up, coming to the N64. Acclaim is talking about Shadow Man 2 or 3, and Mike Leroy, and Turok Games. Seems like they were all in the mix. Capcom are trying to squeeze Street Fighter 3 onto a cartridge. Ambitious. Left Field is about Excitebike 64 and NBA Courtside. More sports games, eh? And then Retro Studios is a new studio made up of Acclaim folks working on both N64 and next-gen stuff. The N64 diary is just a few dates. Will's birthday, something about Shadow Man, and a Game Boy design competition closing date. Lastly, there's a big orange ad for an internet provider called Madasafish, offering a tenner and a free CD if you sign up. Mad times, eh? Free CDs to get online. This page has got a bit of a mixed bag, really. First off, there's a piece slagging off Cruisin' 3, or Cruisin' Exotica as they're calling it, saying the previous games were rubbish, giving them terrible scores in the magazine and suggesting we should steer well clear. Bit harsh maybe, but they weren't wrong. The Cruisin' games were pretty naff, weren't they? Then there's a bit about Konami supposedly ditching the N64 for the next-gen consoles, which was probably Project Dolphin, the GameCube, in the works at the time. They mentioned Konami still had games like Mystical Ninja and IS-98 coming, and they were working with Project Dolphin, so not a complete goodbye then. The main bit is about Shadow Man. Looks like they're giving away Shadow Man goodies, a backdrop, video, poster, and goodie bag. It's to promote the Shadow Man game, which they reviewed on page 46, saying it's one of the biggest games of '99. They interviewed the director, Darren Falkus, and even went down to London to see some video footage. Sounds like they're quite impressed with it. And lastly, there's the N64 Magazine quiz, with 10 questions to win 50 quid. Questions like, in which game would you find Milton Pike? What's a verb? And, who wet himself? Typical magazine quiz stuff. Bit of nonsense really. But 50 quid was 50 quid back then. You had to send your answers to an address in Bath before September 16th. Last month's winner was Darren Jennings from Derby, so someone actually won it. All in all, a fairly standard page, bit of game news and a competition. Nothing too groundbreaking. This page in N64 Magazine back in September '99 is all about the latest must-have tat. We're talking new goods here, and it's mostly toys this month. First up, Resident Evil 2 figures from Gear for Games. They reckon they are excellent and high quality. Well, they would, wouldn't they? For 10 quid each, or 28 for 3 sets, you get these little plastic zombies and characters like Leon and ADA. Apparently the zombies have detachable limbs. Lovely. The reviewer seems to be a bit taken by the leather trench coat on one of them, and a giant mutant with an eyeball on its shoulder. Charming. Oh, and there's a talking Doraemon thing for nearly 15 quid from the Japan Centre. Seems like a plush toy that speaks when you poke it. They're calling it the single coolest thing, which is laying it on thick a bit, even for them. Then there's a load of Pokemon stuff, naturally. An electric Pikachu keyring for about 3 quid that lights up red when you move it. Sounds a bit naff, but kids would probably love it. Printing pocket monsters, our next little stamp things with Pokemon on Pokeballs, also from the Japan Centre, for £3. They say it's absolutely brilliant, bit much, isn't it? A surfing Pikachu keyring, again from Japan Centre for about 3 quid, gets a bit of a ribbing they're wondering about Pikachu surfing in sewage. Finally, a flying Hello Kitty keyring for £1.50. Apparently they got sick of its vacant expression after playing with it for a bit. Cats do not enjoy flying. Bit random, that comment. Right at the bottom, there's a competition to win Resident Evil 2 figures. The question is, who would win in a fight, Pikachu or a Resident Evil 2 zombie? You had to send your answers on a postcard to some address in Bath before the 6th of September. Easy peasy. This page, yes, takes me right back. We're having a rummage through the delights of the SNES here. Jason Moore's pondering if your old Zelda cart will be worth a bob or two in the future. Reckon he's probably right. Looking back now, these old games are proper money these days. He's banging on about Game Boy Zelda and even the old Game & Watch machines being valuable, which they really are. Yasha. There's a bit about Nintendo getting their knickers in a twist over dodgy Pokemon toys in America. Seems they were clamping down on the fake Pikachu dolls and whatnot. Good on them, I say. Rekaka. Then there's a cheat for Rogue Squadron on the N64, remember that one? Apparently if you hammered in Halifax on the passcode screen you could fly the Naboo Starfighter. Bit of a weird one, but Rogue Squadron was a decent blast for its time. The main bit is all about SNES classics, Pilot Wings and Yoshi's Island. Pilot Wings, yeah, that was a bit different back then. Flying around in a hang glider on the SNES, that Mode 7 trickery was pretty impressive, even if it was a bit floaty. They reckon the N64 version is better, which it probably was being 3D and all, but the original Pilot Wings had its charm. And Yoshi's Island, blimey, what a looker that was. Proper colourful and cartoony. Using that Super FX chip to make things look all swish. They mention about chucking eggs and getting Yoshi drunk. Ha! Good times. They reckon it's better than Yoshi's Story, and yeah, I'd probably agree with that actually. Tracking down all the secrets in Yoshi's Island was proper addictive. All in all, a decent page of retro goodness. The next page in this issue then, we're having a look at Super Mario Adventure. Sounds a bit generic, that title, doesn't it? Anyway, it's coming soon apparently, and they are updating us on N64 games of the future. Or at least what they thought was the future back then. There's a quick jump to section highlighting other bits in the mag, like Worms, Carmageddon 64, Hercules, and something called Ear to the Ground. This page is all about new picks for Super Mario Adventure. In a little Q&A section, they're saying it's a mix of 2D characters in 3D worlds, which they reckon looks lovely, and to be fair, from the screenshots they've shown, it does have a certain charm. The What's the Game About? Bit explains it's turn-based scrapping, a bit like the older Mario RPG, with simplified controls and attacks assigned to buttons. Sounds alright if a bit basic. Apparently there will be familiar Mario worlds and events, like a minecart ride but with a steam train this time. Mario's even got a hammer to smash boxes, which is something. The info burst box tells us it's from Nintendo, on a 128 megabits cart, one player only, no memory or expansion pack needed, Rumble Pack is a yes, and no GB pack. When's it out? Well, TBA tests for the US and UK, but September for Japan. They're clearly pretty excited about it, giving it 4 out of 5 on the anticipation rating. The main article, Time to Welcome Back an Old Friend, talks about how it was originally meant for the 64D add-on, which was a bit of a flop really, and now it's on a regular cartridge and renamed Super Mario Adventure. They reckon it could be out in September. Maybe? Or even later in 2000. They got some screenshots from their secret network of N64 spies, after seeing a measly 30-second video at E3. They're wondering if the UK will even get a PAL version, as the original Super Mario RPG on the SNES never made it over here. They're going to keep an eye on it, as are we all, I suppose. This page of the magazine, well, it's all about Perfect Dark, as if we didn't know it was the most anticipated game at the time. They're showing off some new screenshots, banging on about how it's going to be exclusive to the N64. They reckon it's topped the most wanted lists for 2 years, which sounds about right. Everyone was gagging for this after GoldenEye. It goes on about how it's got stealth like Metal Gear Solid, weapons like Turok 2, and environments that are supposed to rival stuff on the PC, even mentioning Half-Life. Bit of a bold claim that, but we were all hoping, weren't we? Apparently there's even a Game Boy camera tie-in, which sounded a bit odd, but you never knew with Rare, they were always a bit quirky. Borally. There's a little Q&A section where they're asking if Rare will definitely use the expansion pack. They're not really giving much away, saying they're still testing it, but they're hinting it could improve frame rates, add more enemies, bigger levels, that kind of thing. Standard stuff really, but we all knew we'd need that expansion pack anyway, didn't we? They mentioned the N64 having 4 megabytes of RAM, and the expansion pack adding another 4 megabytes, so they could add more environments or multiplayer arenas. Sounded good at the time, more bang for your buck. Looking at the screenshots, there's a bloke with 2 guns, some hoverbike action, and another shot of someone shooting from the side. They're calling one gun a super nasty gun. Charming. They even point out Joe Dark reloading her gun before firing, like that's some revolutionary feature. They're also banging on about how good the hoverbike controls are, saying the analog control is marvelous. Well, analog control was pretty good on the N64, fair enough, and they say there are American celebrities who've asked to have their faces mapped onto enemies. Bit weird that. Rare are keeping quiet about who they are though. Warranty. Down at the bottom, there's an info burst table. Says it's from Rare obviously. Cart size is 256 megabits, plays 14 players, memory pack is no, expansion pack is TBA, rumble pack and GB pack are both yes. Release date is December for the US and UK, and TBA for Japan. And it's got a full 5 red blobs for anticipation rating. Pretty hyped then, weren't they? September 1999 this was, page 19 of N64 Magazine. Christ, that was a while ago now. This page is all about WWF WrestleMania 2000 for the N64. It's a preview, looks like a Q&A and some info blurbs, you know, the usual stuff you'd see back in the day before the internet properly took over. So they're chatting about how many wrestlers will be in it. Apparently lots, which is helpful, eh? They reckon it'll have more than Acclaim's WCW/NWO Revenge, which had about 80 wrestlers. Remember that one? Leotard-filled chaos. They also mention pay-per-views will be in there, like Attitude had, with caged matches and all that. Tag teams are getting some love too. Faster play and more moves, sounds promising. And yes, more moves in general, which is always good. Revenge had a staggering amount apparently. They're also hinting at a Create Wrestler mode, although they're saying it won't be as daft as Attitude's version, which was pretty hilarious to be fair. Then there's a little info box with the techie bits. 128 meg cart, 1 to 4 players, memory pack and rumble pack a go, expansion pack and Game Boy pack a no-go. Coming out in November, apparently. Pretty hyped, 4 red blobs on their anticipation rating scale. Ikasu. Looking at the screenshots, they're saying it's not quite as detailed as Attitude, but loads more moves. Grappling is supposed to be new for a WWF game, which is interesting. They're impressed with the wrestler entrances, and they're loving the camera freedom. I will crush. Ooh, I'm feeling a bit peaky charming stuff. They also mention a spine-snapping move, and updated stats, Premier Manager style, whatever that means for wrestling. They reckon it'll be very good, but WCW Mayhem, on the PlayStation, is also looking decent. Oh, and they also mention you can name wrestlers, and the commentator will repeat it, which they think will lead to amusing naming incidents. Right then. Sounds like they're cautiously optimistic, as you would be back then. This page writes all about Worms Armageddon landing on the N64. Bit of a surprise to see Worms on a console, wasn't it? They start with a Q&A, asking if Worms is a bit old and rubbish, which is a fair point, it had been around a while. They reckon it's one of those games you either love or hate, but they think it'll be a good laugh on the N64, even if it is basically the same old Worms. And Nook. Apparently the multiplayer is the big draw, with all sorts of bonkers weapons. They mention the Mad Cow, the Granny, and the Molesaur, all classics really, just going around and blowing things up. And you can name all your worms, which they seem a bit too keen on, mentioning someone naming their team after serial killers, bit much if you ask me, but each to their own. The title of the piece is, Put a Knee Lid on It, sigh, which is a bit of a downer before you even start, like they're not totally sold on it. But they go on to say, Worms Armageddon is the latest in the series, fresh from the PC, and Infogrames finally got their act together to bring it to the N64. They reckon it's bigger and better than before for Worms fans, and a decent experience for everyone else. They say it's memorable for multiplayer, you get teams of worms scattered about, and you just have to kill the other lot before they kill you. It's only 2 players, which is a bit of a shame, and you have to wait for your turn, but they reckon ordering napalm strikes and hurling French sheep will make it fun. Simple, frantic and silly is how they describe it. Down the side, there's an info burst box with all the techie bits. Infogrames are doing it. 128 megabits cartridge, only 1 or 2 players, no memory pack or expansion pack needed. but it does rumble, thank goodness. GB pack Warintech, nope. Coming out in November, with a UK flag and a Japanese flag, and a TBA for Japan. Anticipation rating is 3 out of 5 orange blobs, so not exactly setting the world on fire then. There are screenshots dotted about, showing worms battling on different levels. One looks like they're on top of a windmill, another is in some kind of mad scientist lab with bottles and tubes, and another has them around pumpkins. You can see worm names above their heads, like Charlotte, Joseph, Alice, Gaston and Claire, along with their health. They have little captions by the screenshots too, saying the levels are straight conversions from the PC. It looks nice even without the expansion pack. Worms are causing chaos amongst bottles, battlefields vary, and you see the worm names and health above their heads. So yeah, that's Worms Armageddon on the N64, a bit late to the party but hopefully still a laugh. This page has got a look at a couple of games coming to the N64. First up is Destruction Derby 64, which seems to be another one of those PlayStation games making its way over. They're calling it car smashing fun, and judging by the screenshots they've got, it looks like your typical racing game but with more crashing. Apparently the physics are supposed to be realistic, and you can wreck your car piece by piece. Sounds a bit like they're trying to do what Carmageddon did, but probably a bit tamer for the Nintendo crowd. There's a little info burst box that says it's 128 megabit, for 1 to 4 players, and supports the Rumble and expansion packs, but not the GB pack, whatever that was supposed to be for this game. Release date is down as November, so just in time for Christmas. Gay. There's a Q&A section where they're basically asking if it's just the same old Destruction Derby from the PlayStation. The answer's a bit cagey, saying yes and no, with some N64 specific courses but mostly the same. They reckon there will be 12 cars to start with, and more to unlock, and at least as many tracks as the PlayStation versions. Sounds like a decent enough port if you're into that kind of thing. Apparently it's being made by Player One, who did Robotron 64, and Milo's Astrolanes, which doesn't exactly scream quality to be honest, more like solid but unexciting. Why? Then down below we've got Hercules, The Legendary Journeys. Right, so another game based on a TV show, this one's the old Kevin Sorbo one. They're describing it as Castlevania for Immortals, which is a bit of a claim. Sounds like it's a 3D action game, where you play as Hercules, trying to rescue Zeus from some mythical beast. Screenshots show Hercules fighting some kind of Minotaur type thing, and another bit with him using a hang glider, bit random. The info burst for this one says it's also 128 megabit, 1 or 2 players, and supports the Rumble and expansion packs again, but still no GB pack. Due out autumn or winter, so a bit vague there. Warrington now. They're also asking if this Hercules game is supposed to tie in with Xena, Warrior Princess. Apparently there was talk of swapping characters between the two games using a controller pack, but it sounds like Xena's gonna be a straight-up beat-em-up, so maybe not. Finally, there's a bit of daftness asking how you address the son of Zeus, listing a load of silly names like Herc-Hack, Herc-C, Herco, Hercman, and even Herc Hogan. Bit of light relief, I suppose. So yeah, Destruction Derby 64 and Hercules, 2 more games heading to the N64, 1 for petrolheads and 1 for fans of cheesy sword and sandal action, or maybe both if you're really bored. This page in N64 Mag is having a look at a couple of upcoming games. First up is Carmageddon 64, which is a bit of a controversial one. In it, seems they had to swap out the people for zombies because of all the fuss about running down grannies on the PC version. Apparently the Germans are getting dinosaurs instead of people, which is a bit odd if you ask me. Makes sense for robots though, like in Turok. It's coming from SCI, on a 128 meg cart, can have 1 or 2 players, and needs a memory pack and rumble pack but not the expansion pack. It's due out in September. They reckon it looks alright, graphics wise, a bit like those Acclaim wrestling games. They mention a highs mode, and that it's got 30 levels and 23 motors, but only 2 player, which is a bit of a shame. Then there's WCW Mayhem, another wrestling game clearly. This one's from EA, and based on the WCW license. Sounds like it's got a similar grapple system to the other WCW and NWO games. It's on a 128 meg cart, 1 to 4 players, memory pack, expansion pack, and rumble pack are all yes. Coming out autumn/winter time. They're saying it's got 60 odd wrestlers, with backstage brawls and all that. Apparently the crowd noises and commentary are good, with Tony Schiavone and Mean Gene Okerlund on the mics. Mean Gene, eh? Who hasn't heard of Mean Gene? They're taking the mickey. This page then, it's got a bit of a mixed bag. An ear to the ground seems to be the main feature up top, talking about Ridge Racer 64 on the N64. They're saying it's coming in November in the UK, and is supposed to be like a mix of the first 2 PlayStation Ridge Racers with some extra bits. Sounds alright. Ridge Racer was always a decent arcade racer. They also mention Ogu Battle getting good reviews in Japan, and Zelda is still taking its sweet time to get over here. Typical. Then there's a bit about Glover 2 being in development, which, fair enough, the first one was a bit odd but had its moments with the ball mechanics. And they're going on about THQ grabbing the Power Rangers license for 5 years, goodness me. Power Rangers games, eh? Could be terrible, could be alright, who knows. And something about Nintendo trying to get Namco to develop for Project Dolphin, which was the GameCube back then. A bit of history in the making there, I suppose, but probably didn't mean much at the time. Down the side, we've got a Q&A, which is a bit of a laugh, someone saying they hate monkeys, and the magazine is taking the mickey saying Donkey Kong 64 will be fine for them. Then another question about Monkey Scale Extric, which they confirm is one of the minigames, along with the minecart level and more. Sounds like they're packing it full of stuff, like Mario Party, but bigger. They're saying it's worth the expansion pack, and it's going to be bundled in, a bargain apparently. Warrants. The main chunk is about Donkey Kong 64. More monkey business from Rare, yeah, you can say that again. They reckon it's going to be special. High-resolution graphics. Remember those? They're saying the game won't run without the expansion pack, which is why it's bundled. Bit cheeky really, making you buy extra bits just to play it. They're going on about revisiting levels with different characters to get to new areas, comparing it to Gads in Shadow Man, which is a bit of a deep cut. 5 different monkeys to play as, over 100 moves, they are really selling it. There's an info burst box with details. Nintendo and Rare are doing it. It's a 256 megabit cart, 14 players, Rumble Pack yes, expansion pack yes, and coming out November 22nd here, and they've given it 5 red anticipation balls, so they're pretty hyped for it, I suppose. There are some screenshots dotted about, showing Donkey Kong 64 gameplay, Kremlings, Lanky Kong being a bit disturbing as they put it, and Chunky Kong dodging a spiked roller, and a little picture from Ridge Racer 64 down the bottom corner too. So yeah, Donkey Kong 64 is the big game they're pushing here. Seems like they think it's going to be something special. Whether it lived up to the hype, well, we'll see, won't we? This page in N64 Magazine is all about Resident Evil 2 coming to the N64. It's a special investigation, they're calling it, bigging up the fact that PlayStation owners have had it all to themselves until now. Bit of a boast, but fair enough, it was a big deal at the time. Cornete. They reckon if you're squeamish you should skip the next few pages. Classic magazine bravado. The headline is just massive. Simply Resident. Underneath, they've got a speech bubble thing, saying they flew all the way to Japan to get their hands on it, so they're really pushing the boat out. Down the side there's an INFO burst panel. Looks like it's from Capcom. Cart size is a hefty 512 megabits. Single player only. Memory pack, expansion pack and rumble pack are all yes, but no GB packer. Release date is October in the US and UK, but TBA in Japan, which is a bit odd considering they just flew there to see it. Anticipation rating is maxed out, 5 Red Bulls. Drecker. There are some screenshots with captions. One shows Leon aiming his pistol, saying it's a determined stance, but Leon's default pistol is no match for the undead. A bit of a downer there, maybe ammo's still tight. Another one mentions fixed cameras and breathtaking detail in the pre-rendered rooms, which was the style back then, looked alright at the time. Another shot shows some doors with a caption about them being conspicuous and to tread very carefully. Then there's one with a zombie falling over, saying zombie fall over, zombie looks dead. Zombie gets back up again. Ark. Sounds about right, those zombies were persistent. Adam Rickett is mentioned in another caption, saying he's got nothing on this guy, no idea who Adam Rickett is or why he's relevant to Resident Evil. Lastly, it mentions chests being used to store items, because you can only carry a few things at once, another staple of Resi, inventory management and all that. Trezen. Overall it's a preview getting people hyped for Resident Evil 2 finally hitting the N64. They are making a big deal about it being on the 64-bit console, and seems like they are quite impressed with how it is shaping up. Good times. This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at Resident Evil 2 on the N64. Blimey, they've actually got it running on a cartridge, which back then seemed like a proper miracle, considering the PlayStation version was spread across 2 CDs. They're banging on about how they managed to get all the cutscenes in, even high-res ones, which is quite a feat. Apparently they've used some clever video compression trickery, and graphically, they're saying it's really rather good, even close to looking like those computer animated films, you know, like Toy Story or Ants, a bit of a stretch maybe, but you get the idea. Taily. Then there's talk about instant access, because it's on a cartridge. No more sitting around waiting for loading screens every time you open a door like on the PlayStation. They used to have those animations of doors opening to hide the loading, remember those? Well, apparently, they've cut down on that thumb twiddling time on the N64. They're also going on about extra characters, mentioning you can play as Leon or Claire, which was in the original game, so not really extra as such. But they do mention some hidden characters you can unlock, and a randomizer mode that mixes things up after you've finished it, which sounds a bit different. Lastly, they mention bonus stuff, like a scrapbook with bits and bobs from all the Resident Evil games dotted around the levels. They reckon all these extras might make PlayStation owners flog their old consoles at car boot sales to get their hands on the N64 version. Bit optimistic perhaps, but you never know. There are a few screenshots dotted around showing off the game. You see Leon with a gun, some moody looking corridors, and Claire looking a bit surprised. Yep, Resident Evil 2 on the N64. Who would have thought it? This page in N64 Magazine takes a look at Resident Evil 2 on the N64, calling it a Streets of Rage special investigation, which sounds a bit dramatic, doesn't it? It's basically a walkthrough, in screenshot form, going through 10 key areas of the game. It starts with the burning wreck at the beginning of the game, naturally, and quickly gets into the action of blasting zombies. They point out the pretend we're dead nature of the zombies, how they keep getting back up, which was always a bit of a pain but added to the tension, didn't it? They also mentioned stocking up on guns at the shop, which is always a good idea. The article highlights the scenery, saying it's not just background but solid and interactive, which was pretty impressive back then on the N64. They also talk about the camera angles making aiming tricky, which is certainly true. That fixed camera could be a right menace at times. There's a bit about finding ammo in a van and getting past a quartet of zombies. Typical Resi stuff really. Finishing off with getting into an abandoned bus, and the enclosed camera viewpoint adding to the frights. They make a point about the graphics being really good for the N64, and the cartridge being a slap in the face to anyone who said it couldn't be done on Nintendo's console, which was probably a dig at the PlayStation crowd back in the day. They also touch on the plot with Leon Kennedy, and the classic zombie thriller story. They mention the controls being awkward, but that with practice you can master them and take down those lickers and mutant dogs. All in all, it's a pretty standard preview piece, getting us hyped for Resi 2 on the N64, playing up the blood and zombie action as you'd expect. This page is all about Resident Evil 2 on the N64, or Biohazard 2 as it's known in Japan. It's a preview piece, looks like. They're walking us through the early bits of the game. Leon Kennedy arrives at the police station, and it's already gone to pot. Deserted, but not for long it seems. Of course, straight away he finds a blood-soaked copper, who hands over a keycard before shuffling off this mortal coil. Classic Resi. Roozy. The keycard is for one of those object-based puzzles that Resi games are known for. You use it on a computer to unlock double doors. Standard stuff. Apparently you need to keep an eye out for item boxes to store your bits and bobs, like in the first game. Check as. Moving on, Leon wanders down a corridor, and the camera angle switches to show a window, and something is watching him. Ooh, spooky. Then there's a bit where blood is dripping from the ceiling, setting the mood. Next thing, he's found some poor bloke on the floor, with a right old mess, where his stomach used to be, without a head even. Lovely. Then comes the licker, that classic Resi monster. They call it the licker here, and say it's known locally as that, which is a bit daft, isn't it? It says hello then attacks. You're supposed to start screaming now apparently, you three. They mention the camera angles are a bit tricky, but it all adds to the tension, naturally. And after you've dealt with the liquor, there are some health herbs lying about, to patch yourself up. Handy. The bit about the bus being full of Walking Dead and Claire being able to kick butt is thrown in there too. And they mention the arsenal of weapons, shotguns, Uzi, crossbow, even a grenade launcher for some Turok-style body juggling moments. Sounds a bit much for Resi, that last bit, but we'll see. Warrant? Verdict-wise, they reckon it's one of the most disturbing and exciting games you're likely to play, full of blood and gore and jump scares. They say the violence is tempered with a sense of foreboding, whatever that means. Probably just marketing spiel. They do say the camera angles, sound, and shadows are all part of the experience. And they reckon PlayStation owners boasting about higher graphics are missing out, as this is a proper grown-up experience for the N64. They're trembling already, apparently. Right then. This page from N64 Planet Mag, eh? It's all about the Game Boy this time, seems like a bit of a Game Boy special. Big headline is Monsters on the Web, and there's Pikachu plastered all over it, so I reckon they're talking Pokemon Online stuff. Back then, online on the Game Boy was a bit of a novelty, wasn't it? Looks like they've got reviews for R-Type on page 39, calling it a stunning update, and one of the world's best shoot-'em-ups. R-Type on the Game Boy, blimey that takes me back. And then there's River King on page 38, described as Harvest Moon with maggots and a fishy flavor. River King, wasn't that a fishing game? Sounds a bit grim with the maggots, typical magazine trying to be edgy. In it? Worry? There's a win thing promising a new game, if you send in your Game Boy camera pictures. Remember the Game Boy camera? Madness. And at the bottom corner, it's JESFREAKS, issue 7, September 1999, saying Bickham's back and been snapping away with the Game Boy camera. So it's all about the camera this month, I suppose. Classic 90s gaming magazine stuff, really. The next page of this magazine is all about Game Boy news as usual. Looks like they're kicking off with a Welcome to Planet Game Boy section mentioning a couple of new games, R-Type DX and Legend of the River King, saying they're both worth your pocket money. They're also teasing reviews for Spy vs. Spy, choice tips, and Pokemon website guides, all the usual stuff to fill a mag back then. Then there's a big reveal about Mario Golf for the Game Boy. It seems like it's taking inspiration from the N64 version. They're calling it a golfing RPG, which sounds interesting for a handheld, and they're showing screenshots that do look a bit like the old Game Boy Golf but fancier, in color. They mention a character creation mode, and the ability to transfer characters between the Game Boy and N64 versions using the transfer pack, which was a bit of a gimmick but kinda cool at the time. They're saying an English version is coming in October, so import gamers would have to wait a bit. There's also a piece called Farewell Old Boy, which is about the original monochrome Game Boy being phased out, even though it was still selling well in Japan against the Neo Geo Pocket Color. They reckon it's the end of an era for the trusty old boy. A bit dramatic, but I suppose color was the future back then. Lastly, there's something about play-by-wire, talking about the Bandai WonderSwan, and an internet add-on called WonderGate, which lets you go online using your mobile phone. They're saying Nintendo has been planning a mobile phone device too, but Bandai beat them to it with the WonderSwan. They mention browsing the web, email and downloadable games on the WonderSwan, which was pretty cutting edge for a handheld back then, even if it was the WonderSwan. This page features a couple of Game Boy reviews, harking back to the old days of the Commodore 64 with Spy vs. Spy. Remember that one? They reckon it was a game to show off your superior C64 to Spectrum owners, cheeky sods. Apparently it's still a bit of an acquired taste, especially if you're new to it, but best played with a mate, naturally, for maximum sneaky fun. The reviewer reckons this Game Boy version is the best yet, full of humor, and worth a look for retro fans and battle addicts, whatever they are. Gives it a solid 4 stars, calling it a forgotten classic. Screenshot shows the classic black and white spies getting up to no good, setting traps, and generally being a nuisance to each other. Kartulikek. Then there's Legend of the River King. Blimey, what a title. Apparently the Japanese and Europeans are supposed to appreciate this more than the Americans, probably because they were too busy with Pokemon. It's a fishing RPG, chasing after some guardian fish. Sounds a bit bonkers, but they say you can spend ages fishing, shopping and battling before you even get a sniff of this prize fish. You flog your catch to buy better tackle and chat to locals for info. They even mention getting robbed by a spider and a wasp. Madness. Waiting for a bite is apparently the best bit, described as soothing oriental music and dumb things to bite. Right then. Still, gets a 5-star score and they reckon it's sweet enough all the same, even if it's not Harvest Moon. Screenshot shows some very pixelated fishing action, looking rather peaceful to be fair. This page in Planet Game Boy is having a look at R-Type DX for the Game Boy. It seems like a bit of a blast from the past, bringing together R-Type 1 and 2 into one handheld cartridge. They're saying it's a proper old-school shooter, proper thumb grinder they call it, and not easy even if you were a whiz on the arcade version. Looks like they rate it though, giving it a full 5 out of 5, reckon it's the best shoot 'em up on the Game Boy. There are a few screenshots dotted around showing off the game. One seems to highlight a heart-stopping moment on level 2, and another shows a fully charged shot. Down at the bottom they've got a section called Excursion on the Version, showing screenshots from R-Type 1 and R-Type 2, pointing out the organic scenery and improved graphics of the sequel. It does look pretty decent for the old Game Boy, especially given how messy these things could get on that tiny screen. They mention Gradius and Twinbee as other decent shooters on the handheld, which is fair enough, those were alright. This page in the mag is all about Pokemon websites. Right as Pokemon was properly kicking off over here, they reckon it's the perfect time to check out these sites while we're all waiting for the proper UK games to arrive. First up is Pokemon Forest X, which they're really laying it on thick for, giving it a top score of 5 stars. Apparently this Julian Cotti, a reader, flagged it up. They're saying it's got loads of pages, tips for the game, where to find all the little critters, and even what they evolve into. Plus, some original pictures to download and game and anime reviews. Sounds pretty comprehensive for back then. They even mention a Pikachu worship page, blimey. Next is Pokemon Japan. They're honest about it being mostly in Japanese, and a bit pointless if you can't read it, but they say there's an English index which is helpful. Apparently the pictures are good, with 3D renders, mid-piano scores, and a big photo gallery. Not bad, gets a 4-star rating. Then there's a slightly weird checkout about Pikachu, dung. Right then, Corey good. Then we've got Pokemon Seizures page, which is a bit of a downer, It's all about that time when the Pokemon cartoon caused loads of Japanese kids to have epileptic fits. They're linking to a Salon magazine article for the medical explanation. A bit grim, but I guess important at the time, another 4-star rating. Pokemaniac is described as one of the original Pokemon websites, a real homegrown effort. They say it's massive and scattered all over the net, with loads of goodies like sound effects, icons, pictures, and even video clips. You could even sign up for a Pokemon email account, apparently. They point out a text walkthrough for beating the game and getting through Victory Road. Another 4 stars. Worry. Lastly, there's Pokemon World, which is Nintendo's official page. They say it's slick and professional but a bit empty, and some of the better fan stuff has vanished, particularly the Pikachu voice sample. They mention it being part of the bigger Nintendo online presence, including Banjo-Kazooie, Zelda, and F-Zero X. And they mention a downloads page and a map of the Pokemon world. This one only gets 3 stars. Bit harsh, maybe? Still, it's all about Pokemon Online back in '99, pretty cool to see it all laid out like this. This page is all about tips and high scores. Proper retro stuff. It's got a big feature on Buster Move 4, or Puzzle Bobble as some of us still call it, showing a screenshot of the gameplay, and some codes for hidden characters and levels. Remember spending ages trying to input those cheat codes from magazines? Good times. Waru. Then there's a section on Reservoir Rat, a Game Boy game, with passwords to skip levels. Never really got into that one myself. Seemed a bit generic, didn't it? Next to that is Klax, another classic puzzle game, again on Game Boy, with a password for a minigame that involves Game Boy camera pictures of the programming team in humiliating poses. Bit cheeky that. I'd be curious to see what those are like, maybe a bit too edgy for 90s Nintendo mags though. Warrington. Below that there's Legend of the River King, another Game Boy title, with tips on how to catch different fish and what bait to use. Fair play if you were into your fishing games on the Game Boy, I guess. Right. And of course it wouldn't be a 90s gaming page without the high score tables. They've got Tetris DX scores, with Richard Ford and Nick Heon topping the charts. Those names ring a bell, maybe they were proper scene legends back then. Then it's Game & Watch Gallery scores, for Donkey Kong, Parachute, Chef and Helmet, proper old school classics those. Finally there's Game Boy camera high scores, for Space Fever, Ball and Run Run, all by Martin Hall. Seems he was the king of the Game Boy camera back then. And right at the bottom, a call for new high scores to be sent in. Proper old-fashioned stuff through the post or email, if you were online, which wasn't everyone back then. It's all quite quaint looking back at it now. This page is the Game Boy Gallery section, classic stuff from back in the day in N64 Magazine. It's all about readers sending in their Game Boy camera snaps, usually of right weird things. They've got a winner at the top, some bloke James Spaulding who reckons his brain transplant worked a treat, and his picture is indeed a bit of a grainy mess, classic Game Boy camera style. Then there are loads of these little grey square pictures with captions. Let's see, there's a double vampire type thing. Someone called Matthew Allman made that, and they reckon it's a good use of the mirror lens. Someone else, James Garner, sent in a controller beast. Looks like a controller made into a face. Bit odd. Chris Baker sent in a picture where there's something a little bit wrong, which is putting it mildly. It's a freaky face. Gavin Douglas has done a rabbit thing called Help Me. They say you need it, mate. Cheeky. Rise Bobbitt's done Samuel L. Jackson. It's a bit blurry, but you can kinda see it. Alex Carlis has got a Mickey Mouse mutant. Cheers to him. Dudley's James Knowles is in there. Apparently ask Dudley's James Knowles about that one. Cryptic. There's a penmanship freak. They reckon he's ugly, and that's why his writing is bad. Bit harsh. Robert Strudwick is there as the Prodigy's Keith Flint. Yep, can see that sort of. David Teixeira has got a tropical disease. Grim. Adam Simmons of Wigan sent in a Royston Vassey local for any League of Gentlemen fans out there. Someone's drunken dad, Evil Edgar. Mad King Detox is what they're calling him. Ryan Medlock's gone all 007 sniper style in 007 Super Spy. Matthew Hart has interesting lighting and mad staring eyes. Loony, they say. Right enough. The main text is all about mops and disinfectant being ready for the muties, their word for these Game Boy camera creations. They're saying the pictures are revolting and from warped minds. But that's the point, isn't it? They joke about stomach acid and half vomit, half burp if you look at them too long. Right at the bottom it's asking for your freaks to send in, saying, mess around with built-in freakage tools, and if it's weird enough it might get in and win a new game. You had to post them into an address in Bath. Good times, the Game Boy camera, proper loafy fun. This page of N64 Arena magazine, right, it's got a big splash about Shadow Man. They reckon it's as big as Zelda, twice as vast as Zelda, and took just as long to make. Bit of a claim, isn't it? Wonder if it lived up to all that. Forinosa Haza. Then there's a rundown of other games coming out. World Driver Championship is mentioned, sounding like their Gran Turismo beta, apparently with Midway Strike Gold, we'll see about that. WWF Attitude is there, promising more grappling and spandex, and a Create a Wrestler mode which was always a laugh back then. Quake 2 is also in there, described as Activision's top gibfest, arriving at last with multiplayer, which, yeah, Quake multiplayer was a big deal. F1 World Grand Prix 2 is mentioned too, another F1 sim, can't keep up with them all, can you? And Command & Conquer is finally coming to the N64, about time. That PC strategy was popular. Lastly, they've got a bit about Pocket Monsters Stadium 2, saying it's coming out next year, with a look at the Japanese version. Always had to keep an eye on what was happening over in Japan. And there's a bit about the import scene in general, import arena, for the games they are playing in America and Japan. Always tempting to get your hands on stuff early. Page number 44, if you're really keeping track. This page explains how N64 Magazine reviews games. It's like their guide to how they do things. They reckon they are the best reviewers, which is a bit of a claim, isn't it? They have an info burst section, here for Metroid 64, which gives you the lowdown on things like who made it, how big the cartridge is, how many can play, and all that techie stuff. They even tell you when it's out in different places, and the price, which is handy. If you're too impatient to read the whole review, they've got pluses and minuses to quickly see the good and bad bits, and an if you like this section suggesting similar games. Here it mentions Mickey Mouse 64. They score games on visuals, sounds, how well you can master it, lifespan, and then an overall verdict. They use a percentage score, with 85% and above getting a star game badge, which they big up as only happening after playing the whole game properly. Anything below 20% is just a disaster apparently. Absolute wretched crud they call it, bit harsh. Then there's Team 64, showing off the reviewers with dodgy photos and silly quotes. Tim Weaver's the angel of dare, coughs, bless him. Will Overton's a Japanese water demon, alright Will. Andrea Ball is a scary mummy, each to their own. It looks like Game of the Month is Shadow Man for a few of them, then Pocket Monsters Stadium 2, C&C, Quake 2, and World Driver Championship. Seems like Shadow Man was the big thing that month then. Lots of love for that game from the team. This page is all about Shadow Man on the N64. Right then, Acclaim's latest romp, and it sounds like they're really pushing the boat out with the whole blood-drenched voodoo angle. It's got serial killers and exploding liaison, whatever that is. They're bigging it up as a proper mature game for the N64, saying it's got all sorts of dark secrets. There's a little info burst box out the side, classic magazine stuff. Looks like it's from Acclaim, a 256 megabit cart, just one player, which is a bit of a shame. Uses the controller pack, but cartridge save is a no-go, password save is out, expansion pack isn't needed but rumble pack is in, Game Boy pack is a miss too. Release date for the US and UK is September 1st, and Japan is TBA. Cost is 40 quid. 40 quid! Blimey, games were pricey back then. They've got a couple of screenshots, one of Shadow Man himself, looking a bit moody in some kind of underworld place, and another, of what looks like a boat. Apparently Shadow Man standing above Undercity with a violator in hand, which sounds a bit dodgy. And there's a secret area in a boat, and you have to blast planks to find it. Sounds like typical 90s game secrets. Bit convoluted, but we loved them. Overall, it's pushing Shadow Man as a gritty, grown-up game. Proper dark and violent for the N64, trying to get away from the usual bright and colourful stuff. We'll see if it lives up to the hype, eh? This page delves into the world of Shadow Man for the N64. It seems to be giving us the lowdown on the game's core mechanics, focusing on this Soul Man aspect and the need to collect Dark Souls. Apparently, the main point of the game, besides the usual stop the bad guys plot, is grabbing these Dark Souls that are scattered about. Collecting 120 of them opens up these coffin gates, which lets you progress to later levels. Sounds like a bit of a collectathon then, doesn't it? They're calling the Dark Souls chrysalis-style pods called Govi, and they're purple, apparently in all their purple-hued glory. Bit dramatic for a soul, isn't it? It also mentions you need to get GAD tattoos to reach secret areas. Sounds a bit convoluted if you ask me, but back then, we lapped this sort of thing up. Then there are these coffin gates, described as imposing structures that lead to new areas or equipment. And predictably, you need a certain number of Dark Souls to open them. It's all pretty standard fare really for an action-adventure back then. Soul collecting and gate opening, nothing groundbreaking, but Shadow Man did have that darker edge to it, didn't it? A bit more grown-up than some of the bright and breezy Nintendo stuff you usually saw at the time. It got a Star Game Award from the magazine, so someone was impressed, even if I'm being a bit cynical looking back now. This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at Shadow Man, remember that one? proper dark game for the N64, wasn't it? This article's all about Liveside, which is apparently half of the game's world. The other half being Deadsides, of course. Right, so it kicks off in Bayou Paradise, Louisiana Bayou, that's where you start the game apparently. You've got to find Nettie, some voodoo priestess, to get your info. Sounds like she gives you a Desert Eagle pistol and a teddy bear. Odd combo, but the bears are linked to the Deadsides naturally. Then it moves on to serial killer lairs. Charming. First up is Cardell County Jail, where you're dealing with 3 of the 5. These are the bad guys, yeah? Prison riot going on, loads of zombies and exploding heads. Lovely stuff. Next lair is Mordaunt Street, New York. This one's home to Avery Marks, the home improvement killer. Power's out, so you need a torch. Seems like you're going to be doing a bit of exploring and using elevators to get around this dodgy tenement building. Ooh. Finally, there's London Underground. Based on the real thing near Down Street, a disused tube line. They've got Jack the Ripper in this one, Spring Heel Jack apparently, and undead dogs. Joy. Sounds like you have to make your way through a train to get to the other side. Classic tube level really. Warwick spree. So yeah, that's Liveside in Shadowman. A bit of Louisiana swamp, a prison, New York, and London Underground. Bit of a world tour for a serial killer game, innit? Definitely looked moody for the N64 at the time, mind you. This page from the magazine is all about the Deadside area in Shadowman on the N64. Right then, Deadside. It was meant to be the spooky, more challenging bit of the game, wasn't it? Warrant? First up we have the Gad Temples, and they're breaking it down into Temple of Fire, Temple of Prophecy and Temple of Blood. Apparently these are where you get your Gad powers. Temple of Fire gives you the Gad Toucher for pushing hot blocks. Temple of Prophecy gets you the Gad Marcher so you can walk on hot coals. And Temple of Blood gives you the Gad Nager so you can swim in lava. Lava swimming, blimey, that sounds a bit dodgy even for Shadowman, doesn't it? They're saying each temple has idols with hidden dark souls too, which is always good to know for Collectathon fans. Corintano. Then there's the Marrow Gates, home to Jaunty, described as a top-fatted Irish snake with a skull for a face. Sounds charming. He's your second friendly contact, and guards these rib-like gates that take you deeper into Deadside and eventually the Asylum. Rib-like gates, right? Nice and cheery then. Next is the Wasteland, apparently a desolate area with the Temple of Life, where you can trade in 100 Cadeau for extra health. Bit of a health boost is never a bad thing in these games, is it? The Wasteland also leads to the Paths of Shadow and the Coffin Gates. Sounds a bit morbid, doesn't it? Asylum Station is next, split into Gateway, Cathedral of Pain and Engine Block. They reckon the Asylum is massive, and you need to use transport to get around. The Gateway has 2 routes, one you can only do later with the Gad Toucher. Cathedral of Pain has 5 schisms, which are warp points to a particular killer's Liveside hideout. Crikey, Liveside hideout. That sounds a bit dramatic. The Engine Block is where you shut down the Dark Engine. Bit of puzzle solving, no doubt. Hoorah! Finally, we have the Asylum hubs. Cageways, playrooms, lavaducts, and Undercity. Cageways are described as gothic train carriages with ropes and cages. Playrooms are disturbing with flesh walls and creeping lullaby tinkles. Nice lavaducts are full of lava, obviously. And Undercity is deep beneath the Asylum, dark, misty and tricky for finding dark souls. They're saying these Asylum areas are full of dark souls, and you'll be revisiting them a lot, especially once you've got all 3 Gad powers. Makes sense, stretch out the gameplay, doesn't it? All in all, Deadside sounds like a right grim old place, perfect for Shadowman then, I suppose. This page here, it's all about Shadowman on the N64, remember that one? Crikey! That was aiming for mature audiences, wasn't it? This page is titled The Arsenal of the Damned, and it's showing off all the spooky voodoo weapons you can get your mitts on in the game. They're going through each weapon, like the Desert Eagle which becomes the Shadow Gun. A bit of a mouthful, but hey, it sucks life force from enemies, nice. Then there's the Esson, which is a skull on a stick that fires fireballs. Very voodoo indeed. The Flambeau is a fire thrower, also doubles as a torch, which is handy for those dark corridors I suppose. There's the Marteau, a jawbone that chucks flames around, and the baton, a spear that's for warping around levels using altars. Sounds a bit odd that. Finally there's the enseigne, not a weapon apparently but a shield, made of leather they reckon. A bit budget that, but it protects you, so fair enough. Oh, and the calabash, which is like a bomb for uncovering secrets, always good to blow things up in games. There's also a bit about Nettie and Jaunty, these 2 characters who are on your side, so to speak. Nettie's a voodoo priestess who gives you hints, and Jaunty is an Irish snake, guarding gates and being a bit more helpful apparently. Down at the bottom, there's a section called Noises Off, talking about the voice acting. They reckon there's over an hour of speech in Shadowman, which was a big deal back then for a cartridge game. meant they had to bump up the cartridge size, which is a bit techie for this page really. They mention the voice acting is good, even Nettie's Cod Caribbean accent, and Jaunty's Irishisms, each to their own I suppose. They even name-drop Guy Miller as the voice of Shadowman, bit of a claim to fame there for him. All in all, looks like they were pretty impressed with Shadowman and its spooky weapon collection. This page in N64 Magazine back in '99 is having a look at Shadowman, remember that one? It's all about the live-side weapons you could get your hands on. They're showing off the 0.9 SMG and MP.909 automatic machine pistols. Blimey, the MP is supposed to be the better one, but the SMG apparently looks a bit like that ZMG from GoldenEye, you know, the Uzi wannabe. Then there's the shotgun, classic really, slow to reload but packs a punch they reckon, and the Violator, which sounds a bit naughty, but it's a dead-side weapon you can use on live side, described as a nasty-looking blade thing. There's a bit called Shadow Secrets, showing you how to find a hidden area in the Temple of Fire to get the Gad Toucher. Sounds a bit dodgy, doesn't it? Basically you need the Gad Naja, from the Temple of Blood first, which lets you swim in lava, handy for finding those Dark Souls apparently. Then it's all about diving into lava, finding tunnels, pulling ropes, bit of a maze it sounds like, all to get a Govi, which is a Dark Soul. 119 to collect in total, crikey. There's a comically speaking bit too, saying the game is based on the Shadowman comic, a bit like Turok and its comics, all Acclaim owned of course. Apparently it's based on the first 6 comics written by Garth Ennis, who some might know from things like Hellblazer and Preacher, you know, those darker comics. And Jamie Delano, who wrote more Hellblazer, also worked on Shadowman comics later. Small world, eh? Lastly, there's Bear Essentials, about Luke's teddy bear. Apparently once you've done a level you can use this teddy bear to walk back. Bit of a cheat really, but handy I suppose. It's linked to Mike Leroy's dead brother, Luke. Bit of a sad backstory for a teddy bear. All very eerie they say when you use it in the game. Luke shouts, "Come on, slowpoke." Very spooky. This page in N64 Magazine, issue 32, it's all about Shadowman on the N64. Right at the top they're banging on about a horror boom in '99. Says it's been a good year for scary games on the old N64, mentioning Castlevania and Resident Evil 2, which was coming in November. They reckon Shadowman kicks the living daylights out of Castlevania, saying Konami's game was alright but Shadowman is far better. Bit strong but alright. Aka. Then there's a section called 5 Alive, talking about some of the villains you'll face in the game. Apparently these Fives are employed by some nasty lot called Legion to bring on the apocalypse. They've got FBI profiles on these blokes, which is a bit dramatic. Bory. First up is Avery Marks, the home improvement killer. Charming name. Apparently he's a disturbing character you meet in a rundown New Orleans tenement, and he makes furniture out of people. Lovely. They show a screenshot of him looking a bit menacing. Warrington. Next is Jack 2. This geezer is Jack the Ripper himself, working for Legion in the underground. Bit cheeky bringing in Jack the Ripper in it. They say you need to find his plans for the asylum and the schisms. Sounds like a right load of old cobblers. Then it moves on to shadow moves. Apparently the control system is a bit like Zelda, which was always decent. They talk about ambidexterity, where you can use items in both hands, left and right, using Z and B buttons. Sounds a bit fiddly, but could be good. Then there's rolling, just rolling about to dodge stuff, and you can shoot at the same time. Swinging is next. Monkey swinging around on ropes and poles, handy in the Gad temples they reckon. Finally, back jumping, they call it very useful to reach certain platforms. Shows a chap jumping backwards off a wall, looks a bit awkward if you ask me. Overall it's a bit of a preview for Shadowman, highlighting some of the villains and gameplay bits. Seems like they are quite hyped for it, but let's see if it's actually any good when it comes out. This page is all about Shadowman on the N64, remember that moody game? It's got a feature called the Retractor Factor, and it's basically a guide on how to find one of these retractor things in the game. Apparently it's some gruesome item you need to open schisms, which sounds about right for Shadowman. Warrington. The guide walks you through the Asylum Playrooms level. First off, you're swimming through some delightful, blood-filled tunnel complex. Charming. Then you surface and get ambushed. Classic. After dealing with those chaps you're heading towards a door, keeping on the same level, naturally. There's a bit about a blood lake walkway, and then some turning left in a tunnel. Typical maze-like game-level stuff from back then. You end up in a room guarded by brutal guards, with antique rifles. Sounds like a right laugh. The guide then jumps to inside a chapel where you find the retractor itself. Simple as that apparently, just walk up and grab it. It mentions Luke's teddy bear for warping to the Cathedral of Pain, and something about schisms being held there. It then talks about going towards the Ripper's Schism, which, again, sounds perfectly pleasant. Eventually you find the schism itself, described as a skinned torso that becomes a gruesome warp portal to Liveside. Lovely. To use the retractor, you equip it, jam it into Shadowman's chest. Nice. And then press the action button, left C on the N64 controller of course, to get sucked into the schism. Ready to meet old Jack, whoever that is. There are a couple of side bits too. One's called Ammo Whammo, explaining the different ammo types for Liveside and Deadside weapons. Apparently the Deadside weapons use these golden voodoo skulls, very Shadowman. Then there's Cadeau, those red shell things dotted around. Collect 100 of them, and apparently you can go to the Temple of Life to boost your health. Handy, that? Showers. So yeah, that's the lowdown on finding a retractor in Shadowman. Pretty straightforward stuff, if you can stomach the, shall we say, unique aesthetic of the game. This page has got a review of Shadowman on the N64. Blimey, remember that game? It was supposed to be like a Zelda, but a bit darker, a bit more grown up, which was quite the thing back then. They're saying here it's massive, like Zelda, and took 3 years to make, using a big 256 megabit cartridge, which was a big deal back then. Massive carts meant massive games, didn't they? Waruna. They reckon it's proper good, creative and innovative, they say. The reviewer is going on about how complex it is, sprawling, with lots to see and do. They're even comparing it to Tomb Raider, saying it's a third-person adventure like them, but proper plot-heavy, and loads of cutscenes. An hour apparently. 70 hours to complete, they reckon. Crikey, that's a lot of late nights. It's all about the dark and disturbing subject matter, but without resorting to cheap shock tactics apparently. They're banging on about the levels being huge, like when you first see the asylum you'll supposedly gasp at its size. They mention a church in the Louisiana swamp level, and how you can just walk right in. It sounds like they're really impressed with the size of it all. They talk about going into these massive rooms, and wondering how Acclaim did it without any fogging, which was a thing back then, fog everywhere to hide the poppin'. There are some screenshots here, a duppy, which is one of the unpleasant residents apparently, then one of opening a coffin gate which looks painful, eh? And another one of the train that takes you to the cageways. Right at the bottom, there's a winged variant of Duppy that spits bright green goo at you. Charming. Sounds like a right old spooky adventure for Mike Leroy and his dark alter ego. They seem to think it's the bee's knees, this Shadowman game. We'll see about that, won't we? This page of N64 Magazine features a review for Shadowman on the N64, giving it a massive 93% and calling it a star game, quite a big deal back then. They reckon it's an out-and-out blood-stained classic, which is laying it on a bit thick, isn't it? The review highlights the game as a massive challenge with balanced gameplay that's dark, disturbing, and even mentions serial killers bit much, really. The minuses are a little jerky movement, and maybe too much of a challenge for some. They say if you liked Zelda, Ocarina of Time, you'll probably dig this, which is a bold comparison considering Zelda was basically perfect. Gigi. Apparently, it's stuffed with things to do and secrets to find, promising a long lifespan of about 70 hours to get everything. Visually, they rave about the lighting and graphics being clean and crisp, giving it a 9 out of 10. Sounds get an 8, saying they are suitably moody. Mastery also gets a 9, claiming they wrung every last drop out of the N64. They mention some of the gameplay mechanics, like portals reached after beating bosses, and the Gad Toucher, which lets you grab onto flaming pillars. The review name-drops comics and films like Hellraiser, Hellblazer, and Silence of the Lambs, trying to paint a picture of the game's mature and horror-themed content. The reviewer, Jess Bickham, seems pretty impressed overall, comparing Shadowman to Zelda but giving it its own darker spin. This page is a look at World Driver Championship on the N64. Right then, Mystic A. Sounds a bit poncy for a car name, doesn't it? Team Excalibur, even more so. Apparently, this game is supposed to be a graphical showcase, pushing the N64 to its limits, like a proper slice of racing brilliance apparently. They reckon it's a graphical wonder, especially compared to something like Top Gear Rally. Boss Games, who made it, apparently used Gran Turismo as their benchmark, which is a good thing, mind you. They're mentioning a few games in passing, like Perfect Dark, Donkey Kong 64, that was a big one, wasn't it? And then there's the likes of Hybrid Heaven, Quake 2, Resi Evil 2, even Turok. Rage Wars getting a shout out. Seems like they're saying World Driver Championship is one of the better games of the year so far for the N64, and they've been following it since the first screenshots. In the info burst box on the side there it says it's from Midway and Boss Games. Cart size is 128 megabit, which was decent size back then. 1 or 2 players, and you needed a controller pack using a fair chunk of memory, 123 pages. No cartridge save or password save, expansion pack or rumble pack or GB pack support, showing a lot of red crosses. Release date says now for the US, September 24th for the UK, and TBA for Japan. Cost you about £40, typical price for a new N64 game back then. Looking at the screenshots, Zurich and Sydney tracks are mentioned. Zurich is supposed to be beautiful, Sydney has nice shadow effects. They point out a glider in the distance in one shot, and a plane taking off in another, little details like that. They also mention a two-player mode being jolly good fun. Seems like a decent racer, and they even say it runs in high resolution without needing the expansion pack, which is good news. Although it's in letterbox format, which wasn't ideal, but hey, you can't have everything. They're rating it up there with games like Turok 2 and Zelda, so it must be alright then. Marvelous stuff apparently. This page is about World Driver Championship on the N64, looks like a bit of a preview or review. It bangs on about the career mode being the main draw, starting at 30th in the world and working your way up, the usual stuff. Apparently teams will try and sign you, which is a nice touch I suppose, adds a bit of depth. Or, they've got a section called Well Trained, which mentions other modes like 2-player, time trial, and practice laps. Standard fare really. They talk about a training mode being helpful for the physics, which sounds like it might be a bit tricky to handle then. Then they go through some of the teams in the game. Speedcraft are described as confident Americans, with a 97 Stallion SRC, sounds like an American muscle car type. Cool Racing are Mexicans who like friendship, and their cars are lightweight, not as good as the German team. Viewpoints are arrogant Italians with Lotus-like LNTTs, fast but maybe not the best at turning. Read to run by a Reginald Goldsmith, driven to make his father proud, bit of a character there then, in an R12 Mantis sounds a bit dodgy. Eurospec are described as having Ram Venom GTRs with acceleration and top speed, a bit of a compromise car. Total Sport Furio is a beast but slides all over the place. Lastly they mention Crash Bandicoot, saying there's Crash Mandu style Kark Knackery shenanigans, which sounds like they're trying a bit too hard to be funny there. Apparently you can flip your car, but only by driving heading into a wall at over 100 miles per hour on the Sydney track. Sounds a bit specific, doesn't it? Poika. Overall it seems like they're trying to make World Driver Championship sound a bit more than just another racer, with the career mode and team stuff. Whether it's any good or not, well that's another question, isn't it? This page is taking a look at the Trial of Champions in World Driver Championship on the N64. It's breaking down the GT2 Championship, which is made up of a bunch of different cups. First up is the Novice Cup, a gentle way to start they reckon, with races in Rome and Hawaii A, 2 laps each. Rome is apparently the gentlest track and the expert's choice, good to know. Apparently there's a long sweeping corner you can take at over 100 miles per hour. Sounds a bit optimistic for a novice, but alright, the expert's course. Then it's the Spider Cup, using Hawaii C and Kyoto A, again 2 laps each. They call Kyoto A an evil track, needing plenty of practice, and mention a new route through New Zealand is included in this cup. Bit odd when the tracks are Hawaii and Kyoto though. Hawaii C is called easy and graphically gorgeous, especially the lens flare at the finish line fancy. The Emperor Challenge is next, where the difficulty ramps up apparently. This one's Rome B, Kyoto B, and New Zealand C, 3 laps each. New Zealand C is making its first appearance, described as having contrasting lush greenery and parched earth. Sounds like a travel brochure. They say cornering skills are really tested, but you can still sling yourself around a bend at over 100 miles per hour without binning it. If you're good, naturally. K-A-Y-A, K-A-Y, 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 K-A. Following that is the Seasons Cup, which brings back Rome and Kyoto, but reverses Hawaii B in reverse. How original. Still 3 laps each though. Apparently this cup wrongfoots you, by reversing Hawaii B, as if that's some sort of mind-bending twist. They warn about a corner where you'll lose the race if you brake a fraction too late. Sounds stressful. Lastly, it's the Drivers' Challenge, chucking in 2 new tracks, Las Vegas A and Lisbon C, alongside New Zealand C, all 3 laps each. Las Vegas is all about night driving and dazzling neon, very of its time. Apparently, there's a huge neon guitar to see in Vegas. Must be tasteful. They mention the first corner in Vegas is surrounded by sand that'll spin you out. Lovely, you neon. So that's the GT2 Championship Cups in World Driver Championship. Looks like a decent racer, lots of tracks and cups to get through. Plenty to keep you busy back in the day I suppose, even if they did get a bit carried away with the lens flare and neon guitars. This page from the magazine is having a look at World Driver Championship on the N64. They're running through some of the cups in the game, like the Orca Cup, which sounds a bit of a beast with New Zealand in reverse, And Black Forest, apparently Black Forest corners are absolutely fatal, you know. Then there's the Endurance Cup, 4 races of 4 laps, each stamina draining they reckon. Sounds about right for back then. Ring of Fire Cup features Zurich and Kyoto, 5 laps each. They call Zurich superbly designed and graphically marvelous, which I remember thinking at the time, Zurich was a looker. Ultimatum Cup has got Les Gets and Hawaii. Les Gets is the slippy slidey ice world. Good description, it was a bit like that, wasn't it? And finally, the Invitational Cup, Lisbon B in reverse for 15 laps. 15 laps of Lisbon in reverse sounds absolutely brutal. Grueling, they call it, which is probably spot on. They're saying you just have to get an early lead and hang on for dear life. Overall, it's making the game sound pretty challenging, especially those longer cups and reverse tracks. Graphically, it was impressive for the time, they are right about that. Good memories of wrestling with this one back in the day. This page in N64 Magazine, issue 32. It's all about World Driver Championship. Right then, this was Boss Games' attempt at a serious racer on the N64, wasn't it? Not like your Mario Karts. They reckon it's got 10 tracks, each with a few routes and even a reverse mode. Fancy that. They're showing some screenshots, bits of track and cars in action. Looks alright, I suppose, for the time. One bit says, spinning camera introduces the 2-player game. Another mentions, lots more gorgeously rendered fog. Well, we'll see about that. Zurich is apparently like real Swiss architecture, and Las Vegas is hard. Course of GITS, their words not mine. The bloke writing this seems quite taken with it. Says it's a superlative racing game, big words, compares it to Top Gear Rally and V-Rally, which were decent enough races back then if you remember. He's going on about the handling, saying the cars are slide happy, and it takes a bit to get used to, like sliding around corners at 100 miles per hour. Sounds a bit twitchy to me, but he reckons you get the hang of it. He mentions there are 33 cars in total, and different cars handle differently, which is fair enough. There's a bit about the championship mode, and cups you can win, Orca Cup, Endurance Cup and such. Looks like you need to get certain medals to unlock the later cups. There's a table listing the events and cup requirements. Seems like you start with nothing and have to earn gold, silver and bronze trophies to progress. Looks like a fair bit of grinding if you want to see everything. He finishes off by saying it's got a steep learning curve, but it's worth the effort. Best driving game we've got, he asks. Along with F1 World Grand Prix, yes. A bit strong perhaps, but they had to sell it, didn't they? Good effort, Boss Games, good effort. This page from N64 Magazine, likely from around September 1999, going by the little stamp in the corner, is having a look at World Driver Championship for the N64. It's a review, and they seem pretty chuffed with it, judging by the headline, Play It Again, Sam, and the big score at the bottom, a whopping 91%. The review is titled After the Replay Feature, which they reckon is brilliant, saying it makes the game look like it's straight out of Le Mans. Remember Le Mans? Proper exciting stuff back then. They highlight the good points as fantastic hires visuals, superb replay mode, brilliant tracks, and cracking championship mode. The bad points are that you can't fiddle with your cars much, and it might be a bit slidey for some. There are a few screenshots dotted about showing off the graphics, which, to be fair, for the N64, looked pretty decent at the time. They're going on about reflections and smoke and skies, making it sound very dramatic. They even compare it to watching a film, which is a bit much, but you get the idea. Boo. The If You Like This bit mentions Top Gear Rally and Boss Games, giving it 86%. They say it's got plainer graphics but better handling, which is a fair point. Top Gear Rally was solid. They've broken down the review into categories like visuals, which gets a 9, saying it's almost faultless and beautiful. Sounds get a 6, noting the engine noises are good but the soundtrack is terrible. RAAAWWK apparently. Mastery gets a 9, because Boss Games, the developers, know the N64 inside out apparently. Lifespan gets an 8, saying the championship will last for ages. The verdict is pretty glowing, calling it one of the best racing games you'll ever play on the N64, and wondrous. Bit strong? Maybe, but 91% is a stonking score for back then. It all sounds like a really polished racer, and they're clearly impressed with how much detail they crammed in. This page in issue 32 of N64 Magazine is taking a look back at WWF Attitude. Right at the top there's a screen from the Attitude game menu, with that bloke the Undertaker pointing his finger like he's telling you off. Classic Attitude. Rawrude. Then there's a few screenshots showing off the game. It's all very blocky and polygonal, but back then it was the dog's bollocks. They've got Gangrel and Kurgan squaring off, Stone Cold Steve Austin giving someone a good kicking, and some grapple moves happening with Shawn Michaels. They even mention Callow's banana-shaped special, whatever that is, and some Britney Spears lookalike apparently, which is a bit random. Down the side, there's an info burst bit, saying it's from Acclaim, 256 megabit cart, 1 to 4 players, needs a controller. Pack, remember those? but no cartridge save or password save, and no expansion or GB pack needed either. Rumble Pack is in though, naturally. It was out in August in the UK, and cost £40, which was a fair whack back then. The main text is talking about how all the rules are broken in WWF Attitude, and how you can fling people out of the ring and use weapons like baseball bats and TVs, which is a bit mental when you think about it. They also mention ring outs, and weapons can be switched on or off before each match. Sounds like a right laugh for a bit of multiplayer mayhem. This page is having a right go at WWF Attitude on the N64, saying it's filling up a massive 256 meg cart, which must be pretty beefy for the old 64. They're proper keen on the wrestlers' entrances, saying they are dead impressive and the post-match stats are supposed to be top-notch, like election night charts apparently, dead informative or so they say. Then there's the customization, apparently you can tweak everything, which sounds alright I guess. They even mention a random wrestler option, could be a right laugh seeing what monstrosity it throws up. Apparently Sable waves to the fans, and they reckon they are all men, well, duh. They seem pretty chuffed with it all, reckon it's the bee's knees, but at the end of the day, it's still just graps on the telly, isn't it? This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at WWF Attitude on the N64. It's talking about the multiplayer aspects being brilliant for a laugh with your mates, especially with up to 4 players and loads of match types. 21 apparently, which is a lot, isn't it? They reckon it's good fun in tag team matches and those free-for-all 4-way rumbles, and even suggest a 3-1 handicap match for the slightly unfair advantage. There's a bit about how they've kept Owen Hart in the game as a tribute, which is fair enough given what happened. A bit of a sad story really. Visually, they're impressed with the wrestlers looking like their real-life counterparts, saying they've got good skin textures and motion capture, making them look convincing, which was a big deal back then on the N64. Although they do point out that while the entrances are flashy, once you're in the ring, the moves become a bit samey, just your basic punches and kicks, even if there are more complicated moves available. It mentions other wrestling games like Warzone, and it sounds like Attitude is better in terms of wrestler variety, but maybe still a bit generic in the actual wrestling itself. They also mention WCW Mayhem as a rival game on the horizon, saying Acclaim is trying to make a good sequel to their previous WWF game. Overall, it seems like they think it's a decent wrestling game for the N64 at the time, especially for multiplayer fun. This page of N64 Magazine, right, it's all about WWF Attitude on the N64. It's got a big splash title that says Mastery. Reckon they're really pushing the depth of this wrestling game. They're saying, despite Attitude being breathtaking to watch, it's the host of extras that make it so good. Seems like they're impressed with all the extra bits and bobs. There's screenshots of the wrestling action, looks pretty chunky, very N64, you know? One picture is a running knee hit, and another a simple jab. Classic wrestling moves really. Then there's one with The Rock carrying someone, they caption it, The Rock carries his dead brother out of the ring. What a guy. Bit sarcastic that, I like it. Torah. They're going on about how it's an acquired taste if you're used to WWF Warzone, because Warzone was simpler, with just 3 buttons for fighting, but Attitude is more complex with combos. If you're coming from WCW/NWO Revenge on the N64, which was pretty decent at the time, then Attitude might feel a bit frustrating at first because Revenge was easier to pick up and play. They talk about a training mode which is good for learning all the moves. They call it trainer tapes. It sounds like they've made an effort to make it accessible, even if it's a bit more complicated than other wrestling games. They reckon the Creator Wrestler mode is brilliant and worth the price of the game alone. Sounds like you can really get into customizing your wrestler and even create your own pay-per-view events. That's a lot of depth for an N64 wrestling game back then. Cheshire Warrant. In the pluses and minuses box, they're saying it's simply gorgeous to look at, tons to play around with, outstanding creator player mode, and authentic wrestling, which are all good points. But then minuses are control method won't please everyone and iffy camera angles at times. Yeah, camera angles in 3D games were always a bit dodgy back then, weren't they? They've got a little, if you like this, box recommending WCW/NWO Revenge and giving it a score of 64/20 seconds, which they say is 75%. They say it's alternative wrestling that's grown on us over time. Bit of a backhanded compliment there maybe. Then there's these little boxes down the side. Visuals gets a 9 out of 10, saying the arenas are dull, but the wrestlers are smooth and hires. Sounds gets an 8, mentions and crowd noise. Mastery gets a 9, reckons it's realistic wrestling. Lifespan gets an 8, talking about multiplayer and customization adding to the game's life. The final verdict is 88% and they call it a star game. They sum it up as comprehensive and authentic wrestling, which improves on the original with stunning visuals and a host of extras. So overall, they seem to be pretty impressed with WWF Attitude, reckon it's a good step up from Warzone, and worth a look for wrestling fans on the N64. This page in N64 Magazine, issue 32 it is, features a bit of a look back at previous issues, you know, those previously in N64 bits. They are giving tips for Quake 2 players, like suggesting you'll need about 8 grenades for those robot blokes, and a bit of a warning about trusting anyone with green eyes and big guns, which sounds about right for Quake. Then it jumps into a proper review of Quake 2 itself, calling it, "Getting Gibby with It." Charming. It acknowledges that folks were maybe a bit worried about Quake 2 after the first one, and it mentions Doom too, saying these games were quick and dirty ports from PC. They talk about the ropey visuals but decent gameplay, and how they managed to bring the PC's internet deathmatch feel to the N64, which was a big deal back then. Remember trying to get online on PC in '99? Nightmare. Pocket TVs and cinema are mentioned. A bit random, must be trying to paint a picture of the time. The review talks about the technical side of things in a little info burst box, 128 megabit cart, up to 4 players, saves to controller packs, no expansion pack needed thankfully, rumble, and all that jazz. It was out then in the UK and US, but Japan was still waiting. Cost you £40, which was a fair whack back then. They mentioned that even John Carmack himself, the brains behind Quake, was happy with the N64 version, calling it the best console Quake ever. Quite a statement. The reviewer seems to think it's not perfect, but still pretty good, and difficult to properly dislike. There are some screenshots dotted around showing the gameplay, with captions about map screens and blokes spraying bullets. Oh, and a 4-player deathmatch screenshot showing a railgun blast. Deadly but tricky to aim, they say railguns always were. All in all, seems like they were quite impressed with Quake 2 on the N64, despite the limitations. Not bad at all. This page is all about Quake 2 on the N64. Right then, stuck in detention, yeah, they're talking about one of the levels, saying it's a bit different to the usual Quake with all the grey walls and beeping computers, which is fair enough I suppose. They reckon it's a bit more interesting with captured allies in a spot of bother. Lower down they say it looks alright visually, but can get a bit samey, which again, yeah, can see that. Apparently the analog aiming is decent for precision, good to know, workers. Then there's cannon fodder, blimey, laser-spitting coyotes, and punchy robots. They reckon the minions are easy enough with the controls, but watch out for those hovering machine gun droids, they'll give you a bit of stick. They mention the Turok-style controls are good for shooting those blighters. And there's a little comment about speed, something about some bloke called Linford Christie, being slow compared to these enemies. Cheeky! Oh, and look, Star Game Award, nice one for Quake 2. And it seems there's a gamers thing to watch on August 7th or 8th. Might have been worth a look back then. Not bad for a bit of N64 blasting, eh? The next page of N64 Magazine takes us into the N64 Arena section, and this time it's a guide for Quake 2, Level Central Complex. Crikey, Quake 2 on the N64, that was quite something back then, wasn't it? They're calling this guide Central Complex, and it's broken down into missions. Mission 2 is all about finding an explosive charge, and it looks like you start by taking out a couple of guards. Classic Quake style. Then, Mission 3 is to destroy a security terminal, involving barrels, pipes, and machine guns. Naturally. Finally, Mission 4, locating and using a teleporter, which sounds like standard Quake fare. They've even got a Don't Look Now side panel, which is a bit cheeky, revealing a secret bonus stage code if you finish the game on easy mode, and warning you that the code only flashes up on screen for a bit. Very sneaky. They've kindly written it down here as FBBCVBBBFBBCVBF7. Good of them to save us the hassle of scrambling for a pen and paper. Overall, it's your typical N64 mag level guide, breaking things down step by step with pictures, back when we actually needed these things, before the internet was in everyone's pocket. This page then, it's from N64 Magazine, back in '99, and it's all about Quake 2. Remember that one? Proper blinder at the time, even if it was a bit late to the party compared to the PC lot. Danana. To guide for Level 3, Intelligence Center, Mission 5, which is all about finding a data disk. Looks like they're holding your hand a bit here, bless 'em. Step 1 tells you to shoot a switch above the first door to get some jacket armor. Always handy. Then it's the laser room, which they say is deadly unless you know what you're doing. Well, cheers for that nugget of wisdom. Basically, run through when the beams are off. Duh. Amla. Next up, it's about finding some ammo in a secret area behind a grating, and then moving on. Step 4 is dealing with a gladiator enemy. Hiding around corners and grenading him apparently works wonders. Finally, Step 5 is grabbing the data disk from the next room, with a heads up about an enforcer ambush and using more switches. All fairly standard stuff really, even back then we weren't complete noobs. Finally, there's a bit on the side about the level 10 boss, a tank thing, saying it's a halfway boss and a proper heart-stopping moment because it throws missiles and you'll probably fall into the laser beam and die. Sounds about right for Quake 2, could be a bit cheap sometimes. Down at the bottom there are some bits about player positions, like player 3 gets a headshot, always satisfying, and a bit about not running at someone with a grenade launcher like a fool. Solid advice all around. The main text at the bottom, the reviewer is saying Quake 2 is proper big gun action, and the death of the enemies is just as good as seeing it on the PC. Bit of a reach maybe, the N64 version was alright, but PC was always the proper way to play it, wasn't it? Still, they were trying to sell it, weren't they? Good times though, Quake 2 on the N64 kept us busy for a bit. This page from the mag is having a good old look at Quake 2 on the N64. Right at the top they've got a pluses and minuses bit, which is quite handy. Seems like they reckon it's a fast and frantic shooter, controls are spot on, and the multiplayer is a right laugh. Downsides are the single player can get a bit samey and predictable, and they're hinting you might need the expansion pack, remember those? If you were into Duke Nukem 0 Hour GT, they reckon you'll like this, same sort of over-the-top alien blasting. They've given it marks out of 10 for visuals, sounds, mastery and lifespan, all getting pretty decent scores. And then a verdict score of 90%, blimey. They are saying it's a cracking conversion from the PC version and the deathmatch is where it's really at, better than the single player, Deki. There's a bit called SSSHH, all about secret areas in Quake 2, saying it's stuffed with them and it's like Nintendo games for finding hidden bits. Talking about shooting switches and hard to reach places. They go on about how finding these secrets gives you weapons and armor and stuff. Proper treasure hunt then. They mention this flying beastie in the game waiting to pounce, sounds like a right nuisance. Apparently the single player starts off alright but gets repetitive, but the multiplayer with mates is where it comes alive, especially with 4 controllers. They even reckon it might be more enjoyable than GoldenEye multiplayer, which is fighting talk back then, in it, saying the levels are well designed for both corridor shootouts and big open areas, even if some bits are a bit dark. They finish up saying if you're getting bored of GoldenEye's sneaky style, Quake 2 is the perfect antidote for adrenaline-pumping carnage. Mark Green seems to be giving it a big thumbs up, reckons you should buy it and get some mates round. This page in N64 Magazine issue 32 is all about F1 World Grand Prix 2 on the N64. Right then, another racing game, eh? We'd previewed the first one back, in issue 29 apparently. Time flies. Looks like they're pretty impressed with this one, calling it F1 World GR, big letters and all. Best you. There's a bunch of screenshots showing off the in-game action. You can see Damon Hill in his Jordan Mugen Honda, Alesi in a Sauber Petronas, and Schumacher in a Ferrari. They're even saying the weather effects are pleasingly convincing, which is a bit of a bold claim for the N64 back then. Remember how blocky everything could get in the rain? The info burst panel gives you the technical details, 128 megabit cartridge, 1 or 2 players, controller pack for saving your Progress Classic N64 stuff. Cartridge save is ticked, password save is crossed out, thank goodness. Rumble pack is in, expansion pack and GB pack are out. Seems it was out now in the UK and US, but TBA for Japan, 40 quid it was costing you too, blimey. There are some tips scattered around the page, like, serious racers only use in-car view, cheeky. And something about slipstreaming and overtaking on braking. One tip even mentions Monza and taking the first corner flat out. If you're brave enough, I suppose. They're calling Monza one of the world's most famous Grand Prix circuits. Well, they're not wrong there, are they? Another screenshot is showing Damon Hill supposedly oversteering and using opposite lock. Very technical for a magazine page about a computer game. They're banging on about replay options being good too. All in all, looks like they were pretty keen on this F1 game at the time. This page compares the new F1 World Grand Prix 2 feet on the N64 to the original F1 World Grand Prix, and also considers the expansion pack for the new game. Right then, so they're saying that F1 WGP2, as is often the way with these console sequels back then, it's a bit of a quick cash-in really, like when they churned out pucks up every few months with updated team rosters. Looking at the tracks, apparently both games are pretty similar visually, muddy looking but decent draw distance, and the advertising hoardings are updated in the sequel. The expansion pack version doesn't seem to improve the graphics much, just smooths out the animation a bit. Cars-wise, F1 WGP had the 97 teams and drivers, with Damon Hill's Arrows and a Williams as examples. F1 WGP 2 feet updates it to 98, but apparently BAR is missing and the rest are a bit off for the actual 1999 season, which is a bit daft really. Again, the expansion pack just gives smoother car animation, but visually, no real difference. Handling-wise, both games have decent analog control and 3 difficulty settings. The big change in F1 WGP2 feat is the tyre grooves from the '98 season are simulated, making the cars trickier to drive, especially braking and corners. The expansion pack makes things a touch easier, with a slightly higher frame rate, but nothing major. Down below the comparison table they're talking about how the original F1 World Grand Prix was a surprise hit, made by the Pilotwings 64 chaps, and it looked amazing for the N64 at the time. Proper smooth graphics and all that. But F1 WGP2 feat is out pretty quickly after, and it sounds like they're saying it's just a bit too similar to the first game, not a massive leap forward, almost like an expansion pack more than a full sequel. They reckon if Rare made it like Perfect Dark was to GoldenEye, there might have been a bigger difference. So it's alright then, but maybe not the massive step up some might have hoped for. The next page in this magazine is all about F1 World Grand Prix 2 and this new-fangled broadcast mode they've added. Apparently, it's supposed to be like watching the telly coverage of a race from 1998, which is a bit of a laugh really, seeing as we were all watching it live at the time. They reckon it's more than just a replay thing, and if you pick the '98 events, it's supposed to be like reliving those races, full distance and all that. The reviewer talks about the first thing you need to do is turn on 1998 events, rack up the laps, and go into gear. There's a bit about Schumacher starting on pole position in the game, but his car doesn't move, and the rest of the pack just fly past him. A bit daft really. They show a race at Suzuka, the Japanese Grand Prix, and mention that weather changes are optional. Apparently, in this broadcast mode, even though Schumacher starts normally, he then just goes backwards through the field, which isn't exactly accurate to '98, is it? By the end of the first lap, Schumacher is right down the back, in the same position he was in '98, so maybe it's not that bad. There's another example from the Canadian Grand Prix where they say it always starts with a pile-up, and 1998 was no different apparently. In the game though, there are no collisions, no flying bits, and no euphemistic referrals to Jean Alesi, which is a bit of a dig I suppose. They show a picture of Alesi going into a corner, and then joke about seeing pictures of him walking back to the pits. Cheeky. There's a bit in a box at the bottom called Mastery saying F2 WGP2 is for real hardcore F1 fans, and if you are, you're best off sticking with the first F1 WGP. They say with the 99 stats, it might be okay to recommend, but as it is, maybe not. It sounds like they're saying the first game had every option anyway, so this new one isn't that much of a step up. They reckon it's still a massive selling point for a game though, this F1 license. Fair enough I suppose. This page in N64 Magazine, back in the day, is having a look at F1 World Grand Prix 2. Right then, so it seems they're quite keen on this Teach Me tutorial mode, saying it's a bit of alright for learning the ropes if you want to be a virtual F1 champ. They reckon the broadcast mode is a bit naff, but this tutorial is tucked away and is actually quite useful for once. The article bangs on about break dancing, which sounds a bit daft, but it's about this new braking light to help you know when to slam on the anchors, which is handy. Apparently the game is a bit like the original F1 World Grand Prix, and they are wondering if it's worth the upgrade, especially as the original was already on Player's Choice for £30. 40 quid for this new one seems a bit steep when it's not loads better than the first game, even with the expansion pack. They're moaning about PC gamers getting free patches, and why console gamers should pay full price for what feels like the same thing again. Bit harsh maybe? Warranture. They do mention another racing game, Racing Simulation Monaco Grand Prix, saying it's not as deep as the original F1 game but still fast and furious fun, so maybe a decent alternative. Then there are these little boxes with scores and comments. Visuals and mastery get a 9, sounds get an 8, and lifespan get a 7. The plus points are that it's the best F1 game on console, and you don't need an expansion pack, even if it is a tiny bit faster with one. The minus is that the stats are from '98, so a bit out of date. The verdict is a bit lukewarm, saying it's too similar to the original, and only worth it if you never played the first one or can't find it cheap, and they give it a 72%. James Ashton is the name at the bottom, so he's the one who's not overly impressed then. Fair enough, can't win them all. This page in N64 Mag issue 32 takes a look at Command & Conquer coming to the N64. Right at the top, it's having a bit of a reminisce about the drag and drop controls in PC games, saying that C&C is similar in that you drag your cursor around to select units. They do moan a bit about the N64 stick not being as precise as a mouse though, which, yeah, fair point. Asa. There's a little bit about the fog of war they call it, the black stuff, which is accurate enough I suppose, and then there's General Shepard, who apparently is a real laugh at parties. Good to know. They've got some screenshots of the game showing SAM sites, Tiberium and some Nod forces. Evil forces apparently. Bit dramatic lads. They mention a mission where you have to march into a village and put down some feisty revolutionaries. Sounds a bit dodgy, doesn't it? Down the bottom in the info burst bit it says it's from Nintendo, 128 megabit cart, 1 player, and cartridge save is in, password save and rumble pack are out, typical for N64. Says it's out now in the US and UK, and TBA for Japan. Cost is £40, which was a fair whack back then. Then there's a section called Men's Stealth talking about units. Humvee, Sniper, and Helicopter. Humvees are fast for scouting, Snipers good for picking off soldiers from distance, and Helicopters are tricky to control, but good for darting around the map and can take a bit of damage. Standard Command and Conquer stuff really. Sounds like they are trying to highlight the sneaky approach you could take. Not bad for a console port, must admit. This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at Command & Conquer on the N64. Blimey, remember when we were all still playing Yoshi's Island on the SNES? Good times. Anyway, they are saying that even though CNC is a bit old by 1999 standards, it's still a decent game. Apparently it feels a bit like Sim City crossed with Jungle Strike, which sounds about right for a strategy game where you are building bases and sending troops out. They reckon the control system isn't amazing, especially if you are used to a mouse on the PC, which is fair enough. Graphically it's had a bit of an upgrade for the N64 with this pack attack mode, but it sounds like it slows the game down a fair bit, making it a bit sluggish to move the cursor around. They do say the normal graphics mode is alright though. The reviewer is saying that Nintendo were charging a fair whack for this game back then, £40. Considering it was already out on PC years before, and PlayStation owners were getting sequels like Tiberian Sun and Red Alert for less dosh, it seems a bit cheeky. Still, at least we finally got to play CNC on the N64, I suppose. They mentioned something about cutscenes being rubbish too, which is never a good sign. This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at Command & Conquer, or CNC as we called it back then, on the N64. Right at the top it says Build, Mine, Fight, which sums it up really. They reckon it's war, so you need a base obviously. The review starts off with pluses and minuses. On the plus side, they liked the war setting, the missions were diverse, and there were some stealthy bits, which is good. On the minus side, they moaned about the control system being annoying, said it was like a 4-year-old PC game, which it was, to be fair, and that the hires mode was super slow. Hardly surprising really. The N64 wasn't exactly a powerhouse compared to PCs even then. If you like this section points you towards Chopper Attack GT, which got 81% in N64 Magazine issue 20. Apparently it's a fun chopper action game with a good soundtrack. If you're into that sort of thing, you bowl. Then they get into the ratings. Visuals gets a 7, saying the new 3D look is better than the PC version, but then immediately say the hires mode is slow again, typical N64 limitations. Sounds gets a 6, apparently the music and soldier noises are dreadful and minimal, but there's plenty of speech in the briefings. Mastery also gets a 6, they reckon it could have been done on the SNES, and the N64 is just ticking over. Ouch, bit harsh maybe. Lifespan gets a 7, plenty of missions but no multiplayer, which is a bit of a downer, meaning there's nothing to go back to after you finish it. Warrior. The verdict at the bottom is 75%. They call it a lazy 4-year-old PC conversion. Still solid but not spectacular. They reckon the analog stick is better than the PlayStation's D-pad, but still not as good as a mouse for precision, which is definitely true for these kinds of games. They mention Star Wars Episode 1 and Zelda as games that would be good with smooth analog stick movement, which is a fair point. They grumble about the control system again, saying it ruins the appeal a bit, and it's not the genius PC experience people expected from CNC. They do mention the buildings and units you can build, like MCUs, refineries, barracks, power stations, weapons factories and repair pads, explaining what they do in short blurbs. Talk about dragging and selecting your men and chucking them at the enemy, which is classic CNC gameplay. Blurb. Right at the end they mention StarCraft is coming to the N64, saying that because CNC has been cloned so many times since its original release, with StarCraft on the way, you expect more than you actually get with this N64 version. They finish off saying Rockstar, who did Quake 2 on the N64, could have done a better job, and question why put a 4-year-old PC conversion on the N64, when it can do amazing original games. Bit of a mixed bag then, still good then but not good enough, is how they wrap it up. Tim Weaver wrote it, by the way. This page is all about import games, specifically from Japan and America, because back then the N64 was region-free, which was a bonus. It's previewing Pocket Monsters Stadium 2, or Pokemon Stadium 2 as we'd probably call it now. Apparently they reviewed the first game back in issue 20, so this must be issue 32, which makes sense for 1999. There's some screenshots showing off the 3D battles. You've got a Gengar looking ready to rumble, then Pikachu and Raichu side by side, a Psyduck looking a bit doolally as usual, and even a Rattata, bless him. They're making a joke about Wheels disease and Rattata, which is a bit dark, even for us Brits. They also reckon the computer trainer's Pokemon selection is a bit rubbish. The infoburst bit has the game facts. It's for the N64 of course, a 256 megabit cart, for 1 to 4 players, needs a controller pack for saving, doesn't need the expansion pack or rumble pack or GB pack, whatever they are. It was due out in Japan in March, and would set you back about 6,800 yen, which they reckon is about 35 quid. Importing games was always a bit pricey, wasn't it? Overall, it's a quick look at Pokemon Stadium 2, saying it's got all 151 Pokemon, unlike the first one which only had 40. They think it'll be popular when it eventually gets translated to English. Pretty standard import preview really, bit exciting at the time if you were a Pokemon fan I suppose. This page is all about Pokemon Stadium 2, blimey, remember that one? It's got a big title splashed across the middle, Stadium 2, in that classic blocky style. They're calling it a torture machine, which is a bit strong, even for Pokemon, isn't it? Anyway, it's a preview piece, and it's talking about all the minigames they've crammed in. They've got these little boxes describing each one, like Mini Glee with Drowsy swinging about on a pendulum, Diglett Rings which looks like Whack-A-Mole with Diglets, and Pikachu Torture, charmingly named, with Pikachus and Voltorbs getting zapped. Then there's Magikarp Flip, poor useless Magikarp trying to jump over a counter, Clefairy College with Clefairy doing some sort of dance lesson, and Lickitung Sushi where you feed Lickitung Sushi from a conveyor belt. Sounds a bit mental, doesn't it? They reckon the graphics are good, stunning to look at they say, with 9/10 for visuals and sounds, and mastery bit generous aren't they? But alright, it was N64, everything looked amazing back then compared to the old SNES. The reviewers going on about how the Pokemon look alive and have breath and skin, a bit over the top if you ask me, they're still just polygons aren't they? They're also banging on about needing a Japanese Game Boy cart to get the most out of it, because you need to import your monsters over, and you might get Mewtwo if you're lucky. Japanese import games, always a pain weren't they? 50 quid for an import, surface of the moon prices back then, but they say it's worth it if you're a true Pokemon fan. And the verdict is 83%, an essential edition, almost certainly a star game. Bit keen aren't they? But fair enough, Pokemon Stadium 2, it was a laugh, especially with your mates. This page of Club 64 in the magazine, right, it's all about getting the most out of your N64, in it. Big feature this month is Star Wars Episode 1, Racer. Remember that? Pod racing, proper fast, seemed amazing at the time, with all the Episode 1 buzz. They're saying the remaining tracks are smashed open, whatever that means, maybe it's a Part 2 guide, rower. Then you've got the usual bits and bobs. Club 64 mailbox for what people are moaning about, how to. F1 WGP 2 inches, Formula 1 World Grand Prix 2, remember that one? Trying to get to the checkered flag, as if we didn't know that's the point of F1 games. Tips extra, just general hot tips for games, always vague those bits. Dr. Kit's Game Clinic, some bloke offering gaming solutions. From the sinister Dr. Kit's, bit dramatic for a games doctor, eh? Nintendo Hotline, for common questions answered, probably about how to plug your console in. Game On, with more tricky challenges for the hardcore players. I'm the best, for even more new leagues if you thought you were good. Skill Club 64 inches asking if you're good enough for the Platinum Club, very exclusive. Then Contact for buying, selling and swapping games with your mates or maybe strangers, and a directory to check before you buy anything. Probably game shops and stuff. Lastly, back issues and subscriptions to get your fix of the magazine every month. Yeah, standard Club 64 page from September 1999. This page of Club 64 mailbox, right, it's your typical letters page from back in the day. The star letter is from a fella complaining about the drip feed of games on the N64 compared to the PlayStation, bringing up Star Wars Episode 1. Racer's one of the few decent titles. Bit harsh maybe, but we were all feeling the game drought at times, weren't we? Then there's a correction corner, always good for a chuckle. Seems like they got a few things wrong in previous issues, like saying "ja" is Finnish when it's Swedish. Someone got their Scandi languages mixed up. Also, someone moaned about Micro Machines getting 86% but no star award, and they messed up the Mario Kart review date. Oops. Warrington me. Someone called Chris Lowe sent in some sketches for a perfect dark style game. Reckon they'd be good in GoldenEye or Turok. 2 loads of gun ideas, very imaginative. You had to love sending stuff like this in back then. Lastly, there's tackle shops, someone writing in with Zelda game ideas, raft rides, more fishing, costume changes, and 4-player deathmatch. They're brainstorming some pretty wild stuff for a Zelda game, including Co-op with Zelda, Link, Darunia and Mr. Ingo fighting Ganon and skeletons. Sounds like a right laugh actually. Good ideas from Thomas, and Ed the editor seems to quite like them too, especially the extra big pond. This page of N64 Magazine, right, kicks off with a bit of a daft puzzle about monkeys walking and light bulbs, typical office time waster fodder. Then there's a reader, bless him, in Croydon, who's confused why he got a free book called Game Over with his magazine. Ed, the editor, explains it was a bonus for some lucky readers, like a, there you go for missing out on previous issues, clever marketing trick that was back then I suppose. He also mentions the Mario Party and Turok 2 double game guide which they were pushing at the time. Indul. Next up, someone called Jan from Manchester is questioning if Beetle Adventure Racing is even a real game. He reckons it's an April Fool's joke from the mag, saying the screenshots look like they're from Wario Stadium. Bit harsh, mate. Ed has to come clean and admit the game was delayed. Typical of game releases back then, always slipping and sliding. Apparently it was pushed back because they needed to add more textures, then slipped again to July. Ah, the joys of waiting for games back then, eh? They mentioned they reviewed 0 Hour, presumably Duke Nukem, 0 Hour, and were told Beetle Adventure Racing would be out in May, but clearly, that didn't happen. Another reader, Tom from Basingstoke, is moaning about them publishing a guide for Duke Nukem, 0 Hour before the game's even out. Bit of a spoiler issue, he thinks. Ed sort of agrees, mentioning the delays again. It's all becoming a bit of a saga, isn't it? Ow. Then we have a quick one praising the Star Wars Episode 1, Racer Telly advert. Someone was impressed by it anyway. Can't say I remember being blown away myself, but each to their own. Moving on, there's this hilarious letter from a Ross in Scotland suggesting a Windows 64 feat for the N64. Imagine that. Word processors and spreadsheets on your Nintendo 64. He's even talking about databases. Ed's having none of it, being properly sarcastic about spreadsheets on the N64. Good luck with that, mate. Finally, under Imagination's Gone Mental, we have a letter about a game idea called First Do No Farm. It's got a sniffer pack controller add-on so you can smell the farm, 3D farming action, a Ganondorf-like baddie, and overflowing urinals. Right then, Ed's response is pretty much yeah whatever mate, imagining Miyamoto himself getting stuck in with the virtual welly boots. Sounds unique, let's say. All in all, a typical letters page, bit of confusion, bit of complaining, and some downright odd ideas. Just another month in the world of N64. This page of N64 Magazine's mailbag section, bonus letters, kicks off with some reader moans and questions, and the usual cheeky replies from Ed, the editor. Someone called Crying Man is blaming the mag for failing his A-levels, and Ed's just like, yeah, our fault. Classic Ed. There's a bit about a rocket launcher from B&Q and discontinued lines, and someone else reckons they don't want the mag to make fools of themselves, to which Ed's dryly responds, a bit too late unfortunately. Someone asks what N64 Magazine tastes like, and Ed's reply is simply, fruity. Then there's a section called Sachet, about someone finding an Andros sachet in a French restaurant. Apparently, Andros is some kind of nemesis, all a bit odd. Next up, Strange Blue is about a reader spotting a blue character in a Mario Kart 64 screenshot and wondering if it's a secret character. Turns out it's Magi Cooper, that little wizard fella from Super Mario Bros. 3 on the NES, or SNES as we used to say. Apparently he was meant to be in Mario Kart 64 but got replaced by Donkey Kong. They reckon it was because he was too similar to Yoshi and Toad, and Wario needed another fatso to balance things out. Seemed fair enough. Finally, there's So Tell Me This, which is the questions and answers bit. First question is about a new Mario Kart 64 sequel. Disappointingly, the answer is no, but they mention that EA Cricket World Cup 99 has just come out on PC, and it's a bit pants. They do say that Brian Lara Cricket from Codemasters was supposed to be an N64 conversion, but it seems to have vanished. Someone asks about getting hold of an N64 controller, and they point you to some website and say they're about £40, or £25 if you are American, plus tax. Next question is about airplane sims, and the reader doesn't want another Jane's F-15 type game on the N64, as N64 owners don't really want those kinds of games. They mention Harrier 2000, and one might be good though. Then there's a question about Destruction Derby 64, and apparently it's still in development despite not hearing much about it. They say they've played a copy and it's looking good, developed by Looking Glass who did the not-so-great N64 CNC conversion. Roxa. Finally, there are questions about retro Nintendo compilations like Donkey Kong 1, 2 and 3, and sequels to Diddy Kong Racing and Lilac Wars. The answer is no to retro compilations on the N64 itself, but maybe on Game Boy Color. For Diddy Kong Racing 2, not a direct sequel, but the Mickey Mouse racing game next year will use the same engine. And for Lilac Wars, expect a third Star Fox game on the Dolphin, which we now know as the GameCube of course. This page has a section called the N64 board, which is showcasing readers' art. Looks like they asked people to be artistic and send in their drawings. There's a drawing of Mewtwo the Pokemon, sent in by Derry Triherne from Salisbury. Someone called Neil Conley in Stockport drew Yoshi, it's quite bright and colourful. Daniel Lilly from Manchester did Bomberman, and Kazumi Hirota from Middlesex sent in a drawing of the team on an envelope, which is a bit different. Lastly, Stuart Holden in Aberdeen drew Joanna Darks. They say it's a Will Overton-style tribute, whoever Will Overton is. And someone called Jason Frost in South Australia drew Lupus from something or other. Next to that, there's an advert for a place called RETRO, and it says the home of classic games. Seems like they buy, sell and part exchange all the old formats. They've listed loads of consoles they deal with, going way back, like Nintendo, Sega Master System, Neo Geo, PC Engine, Atari, and even Sinclair ZX Spectrum. They're also listing a load of games from back in the day, like Zelda, Metroid, Metal Gear, Castlevania, R-Type, Phantasy Star, Alex Kidd, Shinobi, King of Fighters 98, Metal Slug X, Last Blade 2, Star Raiders, Asteroids, Centipede, Defender, Manic Miner, Jet Set Willy, and Underworld Elite, amongst others. They must be hoping to catch the retro crowd, even back then. Chader. Then at the bottom there's another advert. This one is to advertise in the N64 magazine itself. If you want to put your advert in the N64 shopper section, you need to call Rachel Tippett or email her, and they say they do free design and typesetting service available. It's got the N64 Magazine Globe mascot character in it. This page from N64 Magazine, right, takes us to the Mailbox Club section, or Right You Are as they've called it here, which is a bit cheeky. It's all about readers writing in to give their thoughts on games, and to moan if they think the mag got a review score wrong. Good times. First up is Vigilante 8, getting a solid 88%. Hedley Gabriel from Essex sounds properly chuffed with it, calling it a rip-roaring, tire-squealing classic. He's on about the madcap car combat with wicked wheels and all that. Sounds like he's having a proper blast with the multiplayer, which back then was always where it was at. Then we've got WCW/NWO Revenge, which has got Barney Howes from Chelmsford in a right state. He's fuming about the magazine's review score of 75%, reckons it should be way higher, calling it the best game ever. He's laying into the graphics and how clunky it is, but still loves it, bless him. He even suggests buying Warzone instead, which, each to their own, mate. Bit harsh perhaps. Next, Body Harvest with a whopping 98%. Matthew Dix from Tyne and Ware can't believe the magazine gave Zelda a higher score. He's not holding back, is he? Calling Zelda boring and saying Body Harvest is way better with bugs and guts and all that. Bit much maybe, but fair enough, he's passionate about it. Warrior. Finally, Silicon Valley, scoring 92%. Tony Welch from Chester got this for Christmas and reckons it stood out. He likes the puzzles and the original ideas, saying if there were more games like this the N64 would be flying. He even says, if you haven't got it, go get it now. Bit keen, Tony, but good on him for enjoying it. So yeah, just a page of readers having their say. Good to see what folks were actually thinking back then, and what games were getting them excited, or well, not so excited, in the case of poor old WCW/NWO Revenge. Always a good bit of reader feedback in these mags. This page is a right blast from the past, isn't it? It's a how-to guide for Star Wars Episode 1. Racer, Sebula style no less, which, if you remember Sebula, wasn't exactly a good thing. They're saying about burning it up, so it's all about getting good at the pod racing game. There's a big splash image of a pod racer. Looks like Anakin's maybe, doing its thing with the engines firing. Below that, there's a section called What We Said, and it's showing a review box for the game from issue 30. Apparently back then they gave it a whopping 88%, calling it actually worth all the hype. Bit strong that, wasn't it? Hype for episode 1 was a thing, that's for sure. Ebilry. Peter. The article text itself is about giving tips for the game, especially for the trickier tracks in the game, saying they're following up from tips they gave in issue 31 for the first 14 tracks. Blimey, seems they were really into this game at the time. Is talking about keeping your pod out of the ditch and not smashing up your engines. Good advice for anyone playing Racer for the first time, I suppose. It's suggesting your opponents won't even see you for dust if you follow these tips. A bit optimistic perhaps. Still, good memories of that game, even if the film was a bit of a letdown for some. This page in Club 64, the how-to section, is all about burning it up Sebulba style in Star Wars Episode 1, Racer on the N64. It's part 2 of something called ARS Traccess, Galactic Pod Racing Circuit. Sounds like they're giving tips for the different tracks in the game. This bit here is about the Executioner track. They're saying about the 0G sections, which were a bit of a novelty back then, and that the floating chunks of ore can be tricky. They've got 6 steps with screenshots, showing different parts of the track and giving advice. Etia. Number 1 is about the first tunnel, saying keep to the right to stay ahead. Number 2 mentions a narrow bridge, and to push down on the analog stick to avoid scraping the sides. Number 3 talks about a shortcut in the next tunnel, needing you to stay left, and then dodge right, to find a secret passage. Sneaky. Number 4 warns you to disengage boost before the 0G tunnel to avoid crashing. Sensible advice that. Number 5 is about boosting across an open area and lining yourself up for a rotating door, and to take the third tunnel on the right afterwards for the 0G section. Finally, number 6 is about hugging the last bend before the finish line to keep your position. The screenshots are pretty small, classic N64 blurry graphics, but you can see the pod racers zooming along and the different track environments. There are also lap times and positions shown in the screenshots, like 2 minutes 14 seconds, 1 minute 56 seconds, that sort of thing. They've even got lap records at the bottom, 5 minutes 15 seconds for one track and 1 minute 40 seconds for another. Blimey, these folks are serious racers. It's all fairly straightforward stuff really, typical tips and tricks for getting better at the game. Not exactly rocket science, but back in '99 when you were struggling to beat your mates on split screen, these little bits of advice in the magazine were gold dust. You'd be poring over these pages, trying to find any edge you could get. This page from an old N64 mag, probably from back in '99, it's all about cheats and tips, classic stuff. It's got a how-to club 64 feet heading, remember that? Taking me back. So there are two main sections, both for Sebulba's Legacy and Grabvine Gateway, and both sound like they're for Star Wars Episode 1, Racer, that pod racing game. Sebulba's Legacy track looks like it's all about shortcuts, nipping through mountain holes and using those boost pads to get ahead. They mention old Sebulba himself might be leading the race. Cheeky. Then there's Grabvine Gateway. Sounds swampy, doesn't it? This one's talking about dunes, swamp sections, and overgrown jungle bits. They say it's designed by the devil himself, whoever that is in the game's lore. Tricky corners, using air brakes in the sand dunes, and braking hard in the jungle. Good advice for back then, I suppose, if you were struggling. And of course, being a cheat page, there are cheat codes. More pit droids, type in RRPITDROID at WatchShop, then bash a D-pad combo, up, down, left, right, 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 up. Who remembers doing all that? Then CY Yunga, to play as Zai Yunga you spell out RRCYYUN at the character select, replaces Bullseye Navia, whoever he was. And finish first in all races to get a team photo on the title screen apparently. Never bothered with that one myself. Yeah, just your typical cheat page really. Back when you actually had to type codes in and read magazines for tips. Those were the days, eh? This page from Club 64 Magazine. Back in the day, it's all about how to master Star Wars Episode 1, Racer. Properly burn it up Sebulba style, as they say. It's a guide showing you the ropes on 3 different tracks. Warrant, first up is Andobi Mountain Run, your typical ice level, but apparently with loads of secret routes. They reckon their way is the fastest if you can keep it on the track, which was always the challenge, wasn't it? The screenshot shows your pods zooming through the snow. They've got a few tips, like sticking to the right inside a cave, and boosting after the statue at the start. Very helpful stuff, especially for shaving off those precious seconds. Lap record to beat here is 6 minutes 17. Then there's Death Row's Revenge, set on Audibana, one of those classic dodgy platform tracks. Floating platforms and Tabana gas containers all over the place. Sounds like a recipe for disaster if you ask me. The picture shows racers weaving through these platforms. Tips here are about not boosting in low bits and using air brakes on bends. Good advice when you're trying not to plummet into the abyss. Lap record for this one is a much quicker 1 minute 59. Jengu. Lastly, it's Fire Mountain Rally, which sounds properly mental. Giant plane flying overhead and lava everywhere. Proper edge of your seat stuff. And they make a point of saying look at the lava, just don't crash into it. The screenshot is all fire and brimstone with a racer flying over the hot stuff. Loads of tips for this one, like using short bursts of speed, not using the Z-slide, and boosting down long straights into the volcano. Sounds terrifying. Lap record here is a lengthy 8 minutes 39. So yeah, classic N64 mag stuff. Bit of help to get faster at Racer. Back when those lap records were something to brag about down the schoolyard. Takes you back, doesn't it? September 1999, good times. This page, we're looking at some tips for Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, which, if you remember, was pretty much the only decent thing to come out of that whole prequel shebang back in '99. They've got 2 tracks covered here, the Boonta Classic and Ando Prime Centrum. For Boonta Classic, they are breaking down how to get through each section of the track quickly. It's all about boosting after the big rock, navigating the S-bend, and picking the right path through the arches. Apparently the right-hand side is the way to go. They even point out the sandcrawler later on, telling you to watch out for it. Standard stuff for a racing guide really, but back then, you lapped it up. Then there's Ando Prime Centrum, which looks a bit more futuristic. They're talking about taking the right path in the ice cave to get ahead and then how to handle the three-way junction with all the billboards. Apparently, braking and skidding is the trick there. They also mention shortcuts near billboards sounds risky but probably worth it if you could pull it off. The screenshots are pretty standard in-game views showing the pod racers flying around these tracks. It's all very colourful and fast-paced, as you'd expect from Racer. Looking at it now, it's a bit blocky, but at the time it was pretty impressive stuff on the N64. Good bit of nostalgia for anyone who rinsed this game back in the day. This page then is a how-to guide from Club 64, all about getting faster times in Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. It's focusing on 3 tracks: Abyss, the Gauntlet, and Inferno, giving you some pointers with screenshots for each track. Right then, Abyss. It says here it's very fast and slippy, telling you to stick to the top route and boost around some containers. The Gauntlet, they reckon it's like a prison colony, and you can cut across corners and drive along the roof of a tunnel. Cheeky. Finally, Inferno, which they say is volcanic. You need to keep to the center and use air brakes around the corners. Yeah, those mags were always full of these tips, weren't they? Probably helped a few of us back in the day, when we were trying to shave off those seconds to beat our mates, or get a decent lap record. Good old Racer. Still looks alright even now. This page from N64 Magazine, right? It's giving us a how-to guide to thrash everyone in F1 World Grand Prix 2. Remember that one? Yeah, it was alright, not bad for its time, I suppose. They're calling it one of the hardest courses, which is probably a bit of an exaggeration, but anyway, they're focusing on the Australia track, Albert Park. It's got a track map, telling you lap distance and number of laps, proper stats like you used to get. Then they've broken down 6 points on the track with screenshots from the game, showing the max speed and gear to use at each point. Bit basic really, but helpful I guess if you were struggling back then. Down in the corner there's a What We Said bit. Looks like they reviewed F1 WGP2 in this very issue and gave it 72%. Far too much like the original to be a serious upgrade option, they reckoned, but added 20% if you've never played F1 WGP. Ha! Always with the percentages, eh? Good old N64 Mag. This page is all about getting the edge in Formula 1 World Grand Prix 2 on the N64. It's one of those how-to guides aimed at helping you thrash everyone apparently. Which, you know, was the goal with mates. They've got track guides for Monaco and Spain. Monaco, blimey, talk about tight and twisty. Proper test of skill, that track. And then Spain, Barcelona. Always a bit of a corner fest, that one. For each track, they've marked out points with recommended max speeds and gears. Like for corner number 4 in Monaco, they reckon you should be hitting 290 km per hour in 6th gear. A bit precise maybe, but I suppose some people liked that level of detail back then. There are screenshots from the game too, showing the action. Looking back, the graphics were decent enough for the time, weren't they? The N64 was pushing those polygons. Basically, it's a guide to getting a faster lap in F1 World Grand Prix 2. If you were really into it, trying to shave off those milliseconds to beat your mates, then this page would have been right up your street. Takes you back to a time of split-screen racing and bragging rights, doesn't it? The next page in this issue is all about getting faster at F1 World Grand Prix 2. Remember that one? Good Racer on the N64 it was. They've got track guides here for Belgium and Japan. Spa-Francorchamps in Belgium, they reckon it's the longest F1 track, showing you the map with numbers dotted around, and little speed and gear tips for each bit, like you should be in 6th gear hitting 255 km per hour at one point in Belgium, and then down to 2nd gear at 110 km per hour a bit later. Japan's Suzuka circuit is there too. They say it separates the men from the boys, and again same thing, map with speed and gear advice. They've even put in little screenshots from the game to show you what it looks like. Proper retro graphics now, in it. Right at the bottom they're proper pushing for you to send in your best lap times. They want proof you're a top racer, like photos or even video. Bit keen, aren't they? They want times for places like Australia, Monaco, Spain. And the tracks featured on these pages, which are Belgium, Japan, Britain, Brazil and France. If you're a whiz, they want to see your times. Sounds like a bit of a challenge for the readers back in the day. This page then, it's all about Tips EXT. Very exciting title there. First up, we've got some nuggets for World Driver Championship. Right, so apparently if you're messing about picking your car, you can press Z to change the colors. Groundbreaking stuff. And if you want pink cars, well, who doesn't? You just start a championship game and call yourself IGN64. Bit of a weird one, but there you go. They've got some screenshots of the game. Looks alright for what it was. All a bit blocky and lowers now, of course. But back then, that was the cutting edge. Then we're on to Mystical Ninja, starring Gomon. Remember that? They call it criminally underrated, which is probably a fair shout. It was a bit bonkers, wasn't it? Anyway, tips include getting unlimited items or gold by going in and out of a room in Odo Castle. Classic trick, that one. Apparently there's a boss mode if you collect all 45 fortune dolls. Sounds like a lot of doll collecting. And a bonus picture tied to that boss mode, intriguing. Something about controlling Impact's head with the analog stick during the intro. Not sure how useful that is in a race against time. Rumble pack support, naturally, they were all the rage then. And some tips for slower falls, avoiding attacks and bullets, and a specific tip for fighting Benkei as Ebisumaru. They've got some screenshots of Goemon in action, looks as colourful and daft as I remember. And a big cartoon Goemon to finish it off. Yeah, Mystical Ninja, that was a bit different, wasn't it? This page here in Club 64 Tips Extra is giving us some handy hints for a few games on the N64. Grus. First up is Shadowgate 64, remember that one? Proper point-and-click adventure on the N64, bit of a weird one for the console if you ask me. Apparently to beat the Warlock Belezar you need to mess around with the Dragon Eye, the Staff of Ages, and the Ring of Belzar. Sounds like a right faff to be honest, but back then we didn't have the internet to look these things up, did we? Then there's Superman, oh dear, Superman on the N64. Well, they're trying to help us out, bless them. Tips for beating Darkseid involve freezing a kryptonite bomb and chatting to Jimmy Olsen, then using heat vision, and even picking up policemen as weapons. Right then. There's also a bizarre tip on how to become a car by glitching the game. Sounds about right for that game. Didn't quite live up to expectations, did it? They also explain how to move the camera around, and how to get a level select cheat which might actually be useful if you could stomach playing it for long enough. Oh, and you can use your ice breath to stop bombs, handy. Lastly, there's a classic tip for Turok 2, Seeds of Evil. Now Turok 2, that was a bit more like it. Proper shooter with some serious fog to hide the draw distance limitations of the N64, mind you. They're giving us a cheat code, BEWAREOBLIVIONISATHAND, which gives you everything, invincibility, all weapons, unlimited ammo, the lot. Perfect if you just wanted to blast through the game and not bother with any of that pesky challenge. Good times. This page is a right blast from the past, isn't it? It's a page from Club 64, the tips section from N64 Magazine, back when that was the place to go for your Nintendo 64 fix. This one's all about readers' top 15 tips, so it's a collection of little cheats and quirky things sent in by readers, probably hoping to win a Macapad controller. Remember those translucent jobbies? Right at the top, cheat of the month is for Star Wars Episode 1, Racer. Apparently, double tapping R makes your racer shout something at the other racers, and pressing A on count 1 gets you a turbo start. Sounds like the kind of thing we were all trying back then to get an edge on Watto's junkyard track. Yee, yee yee. Then there's a bunch more tips, all numbered. GoldenEye crops up a few times of course, because what N64 magazine would be complete without it? One tip is about using the facility level for multiplayer, with 2 goalie nets and ammo boxes to play GoldenEye football, which is a bit daft but sounds like a laugh. Another GoldenEye one is about using Odd Job and Jaws, with auto-aim. Bit of a cheap tactic that one, but hey, whatever wins, right? And another one is about a License to Kill mode team game, in Facility, or License to Kill, where you fight over control of the toilets, mines atop, apparently. Classic schoolboy humor. There's a Silicon Valley tip about jumping on the rain machine on the invisible path to kill a parrot, which sounds utterly bizarre if you weren't playing Silicon Valley back then, which, let's be honest, probably most of us weren't. Another Silicon Valley one is about pressing start and then buttons to get full power, which sounds like a typical button mashing cheat. Legend of Zelda. Ocarina of Time gets a mention. Playing the Song of Storms while wearing your iron boots to hear Link and the storm noises underwater. Little details like that were always cool. There's also a tip for Zelda 64 to go to Zora's domain and light all the torches, which sounds pretty self-explanatory and perhaps not the most earth-shattering tip. Another Zelda one is about going to Gerudo Fortress and using the hookshot on a rope to get a rupee piece. Again, fairly standard exploring. F1 World Grand Prix gets a tip about using rightsy and pausing to look back without crashing, useful if you were struggling with the rear view, which on those old tellies was probably most of us. Mario Party's in there, about using blue mushrooms instead of stepping stones to win every time, which sounds a bit like cheating at party games. Tut tut. Mario Kart 64 also gets a mention, about driving along the edge of Toad's Turnpike and jumping into a barrier to get rescued by Lakitu, which gives you a shortcut and a fast lap time. Bit of a glitch exploit that one. WCW/NWO Revenge is in there. Play 2-player tag team matches and ring out. Apparently the player who's in the ring has to knock an opponent out, and the player outside has to hold him till time runs out to win. Sounds like a convoluted way to play tag team wrestling, but each to their own. Turok 2 gets a tip about shooting the Triceratops on level 2 with the nuke weapon to quickly get it, which, well, who didn't want to blow up a dino with a nuke? ISS 98 has a funny one about making your keeper fall over like an idiot by pressing bottom C then B when holding the ball. Apparently you can do a scorpion kick after. Sounds hilarious but probably hard to pull off. E. And rounding it off, Blastcore gets a mention about building a ramp before exploding the final building in a level to leave you with floating guns after. Another weird little glitch thing that's more for messing about than anything useful. At the bottom, there's a form to send in your own tips to Tips Extra at N64 Magazine with an address in Bath. Ah, simpler times, eh? Cutting out bits of magazines and posting them in. It's all about winning that coveted Cheat of the Month slot and getting a pin badge and maybe even a macapad. Good times, go. OD times. This page from an old N64 mag looks like it's Dr. Kit's game clinic, remember that? Always a bit of a laugh to see what problems folks were having. Right, so first up, Stuart in Ringwood is stuck on Banjo-Kazooie. Bless him, can't figure out how to empty the water out of the sandcastle in Treasure Trove Cove. Dr. Kits gives him a bit of a cryptic answer about using crates and the pirate ship. Sounds like a proper head-scratcher back then. Good old Rare Games, eh? Then there's Alan from Blackpool moaning about GoldenEye 007 on the character select screen. Says he can't get the extra characters to appear, even tried the button combos he found. Dr. Kits just gives him a list of button presses to try, classic Konami code type stuff. Left C, top C, left right, all that jazz on the D-pad. Bits complex, but Dr. Kits reckons it's worth it. You bet it was, everyone wanted to play as Jaws or Baron Samedi. Next up, Craig from Crawley is struggling with Star Wars Episode 1. Racer, can't beat Sebulba. Dr. Kits just tells him to win the last race on the Boonta Classic track. Simple as that. And double tap R to flash his vents, whatever that means. Pod racing was alright, wasn't it? A bit frantic but good fun for a blast. And then there's a list of bonus characters you could unlock in Racer. Aldar Beido, Ark Bumpy Roos, Ben Quadinaros, Old Bozzy Baranta, Bullseye Navia, Clegg Holdfast, Fudsang, Mars Gwyn Duo, Mohonic, Nivaki, Rats Tyrell, Slide Parameter, Team Topagalis, Toy Dampener, One Sandage. Blimey, that's a fair few Padraces to collect. They've listed the tracks you needed to finish to get them too, like Bedo's Wild Ride and Inferno Invitational. Sounds like a right grind to unlock them all now I think about it. Below that is the Got a Gaming Query bit, with that bloke in a bottle again asking for your gaming problems to be sent in. Address for N64 Magazine in Bath, BA12BW. Seems like a while ago now, doesn't it? Good times though, reading through these mags back then. This page in N64 Magazine, right, it's having a look at the player's choice range. Remember that? Nintendo trying to shift a few more copies of games that had been out a while by dropping the price to 30 quid. Still, not bad at the time. They're saying they were taking a break from arguing about Quake 2 to give us these tips. Bet that was a heated debate, Quake 2 versus Boal. Well, anything really. Anyway, the games they're on about are Mario Kart 64, Lilac Wars or Star Fox 64 as some people called it, Snowboard Kids, Wave Race, and F1 World Grand Prix. Decent bunch, to be fair, especially Wave Race and Lilac Wars. Ellie. There's a bit where someone's asking for help with Wave Race, finding it a bit tricky. The advice is basically practice makes perfect, and use time trial mode. They also mention doing power boosts at the start, quick recoveries if you fall off, and using shortcuts. Groundbreaking stuff there, eh? Then there's a question about Snowboard Kids cheats. Turns out there's a code to unlock Sinobin, a new snowboard, and all the courses like Dizzyland and Quicksand Valley. Sounds a bit fiddly to put in. Something about pressing buttons on the D-pad, an analog stick all at once. Apparently, if you do it right, some voice shouts, yeah! Worth it for Sinobin maybe. There's a screenshot of Snowboard Kids there. Looks quite colourful, doesn't it? Corentin. Next, someone's asking about F1 World Grand Prix cheats. And apparently there's a way to unlock bonus tracks and drivers. You have to mess around with the name entry in exhibition mode and type in Williams as your last name. Then change it to Vacation for a Hawaiian track, or Chromed for a silver driver, and Pirates for a gold driver. Bit convoluted, that. Warrington node. Finally someone's stuck on Lilac Wars, and they want secrets. The tip here is for Sector Z, where you can refill your life by flying into the back of the Great Fox. Bit cheeky but handy to know I suppose. And to get a training hologram in training mode, you need to score 100 hits against a Star Wolf exercise. Seems like a lot of effort for a hologram, but there you go, Warringtoner. So yeah, that's the player's choice bit, some tips and cheats for a few N64 games. Good times, even if they were trying to clear out old stock. This page is about the Nintendo hotline from Club 64 Magazine. Back when you had to phone up for your game tips, imagine that, eh? It's advertising their service, saying they're experts on all things Nintendo, staffed by proper gamers, not just some spotty kid reading from a script. They even say they've doubled staff and increased weekend hours to cope with the demand. Must have been busy times. The phone number for general queries is 017-036-52222, and they are open weekdays 12 p.m. to 8 p.m. and weekends 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. They've even got a new automated service for help any time of day on the big games. Mind you, that one will cost you 50 pence a minute, blimey. The number for that is 08916 69945. Kafiku. First one is about Lilat Wars, or Star Fox 64, as it's known over here. Someone's asking how many hits you need per stage. Apparently, Aquas, Bolsi, Titania, Corneria, Katina, Macbeth, Sector X and Sector Y all need 150 hits. Sector Z and Solar are 100 hits each. Area 6 is a whopping 300, Venom and Meteo are 200 hits, and Fortuna and Zones are 50 and 250 respectively. So there you go, now you know exactly how many times to blast those Andros goons. The next question is about Mario Kart 64. Someone's asking who the best racer is, if they should go straight for 150cc, and about the extra option. The advice is pretty standard stuff. Best racer depends on skill. Beginners should try Mario or Luigi. Advanced players Yoshi, Wario or Princess Peach. They reckon beat the 50cc and 100cc cups first before tackling 150cc. And the extra option they're on about is mirror mode. Complete all 150c cups in first place, and you get mirrored tracks. Characters even face the opposite way at the start, bit of a gimmick really. They also mention ghosts on Mario Raceway, Luigi Raceway, and Royal Circuit, with target times to beat, and give a quick tip about power sliding, saying it's vital for getting fast times. Hold R, get some smoke, steer, and you'll be drifting like a pro, allegedly. Good luck with that. This page from the mag is all about testing yourself on some classic N64 games. Proper late 90s stuff this. They've called it 10 challenges to test the best, but really they've only given us 4 here. Maybe the other 6 are on another page, who knows. Niche. First up is Turok 2, Bill Oddie Harvest 2 they've called it, bit cheeky. It's about shooting those birds right at the start of the first level, using as little ammo as possible. Remember those dinosaurs and the tech bow? Mad days. Then there's GoldenEye, Telly Savalas, smashing tellies in the bunker level. Gotta get those kills up while avoiding getting shot yourself. GoldenEye was the king back then, everyone was playing it. Rate. Quake 2. Flag Hag is next. Flag Wars in Empty Space Arena. They're suggesting a 3 against 1 game with daft rules like no rockets or BFG, to make it fair for the lone player apparently. Quake 2 was pretty intense multiplayer back in the day, good times. Lastly, it's F-Zero X Corner of Doom. Seems to be about mastering a corner and not crashing your hovercar too much. F-Zero X was mental, proper fast racing, seriously difficult but great fun in short bursts. For each game, they've set bronze, silver and gold targets to aim for, like some kind of skill club. A bit of fun for the lunatics, as they put it. Yeah, alright, cheers lads. This page from N64 Magazine, right, it's got a section called Club 64 Feet, with 10 challenges to test the best. Bit dramatic, isn't it? First up there's IS-98, beach football. Remember that? They're on about Brazilian beach football, saying it's a mix of footy and volleyball. Proper skillful stuff. Romario gets a mention as being top-notch. The challenge is to pass it between your players in training, keeping it off the ground with headers and volleys. They've got medals for passes, 10, 6 and 4 passes. Then it's NB, a courtside stunted dunkers. Making fun of basketball only being for giants, aren't they? Saying what about us short blokes? Challenge is to play with a team of midgets, minimum height and weight, and see if you can beat the Bulls, Bucks or Grizzlies. Good luck with that, eh? Next, Mario 64 carpet burns. This is a laugh. They're talking about sliding down the stairs in the castle foyer in Mario 64. Apparently Mario's lardy cheeks are perfect for it. The aim is to slide as fast and straight as you can. They've got star ratings for distance. Cleared star, edge of star, middle of star. Classic Mario 64 silliness. After that it's Banjo-Kazooie Flight of the Jinjo. They reckon you've beaten the speed challenges, have you? We'll try this flying one then. It's about collecting Jinjos in Treasure Trove Cove, starting from the ship's mast and gliding to get them all without touching the ground. Sounds a bit tricky, that one. Medals for 5, 4 and 3 Jinjos. Finally, there's a bit at the bottom saying, now it's your turn, asking if you've got any weird ways of playing games, like GoldenEye deathmatches or Zelda challenges. Want you to send in your ideas to get a badge. Remember those badges? You had to write about 100 words explaining your challenge, and where to send it is, Game On, N64 Magazine, in Bath. Proper old school that. This page in the magazine is all about connecting with other gamers, like a digital notice board from back in the day. It's split into sections for fanzines, game swaps, games wanted, games for sale, and pen pals. In the fanzine section, you've got folks making their own little mags about N64 games, full of news and reviews, proper old school DIY stuff. Someone's even after older issues, wanting to pay good money. 30 quid for back issues of the N64 mag. Then there's game swaps. People looking to trade games like WCW World Tour, Turok. Everyone was into Turok back then. IS-SNINI 8, WWF, South Park, F-Zero X, and Diddy Kong Racing. GoldenEye crops up a fair bit too, no surprises there, everyone was obsessed with GoldenEye back then. Casa. The games wanted section is pretty basic, someone's after Game Boy Color games and Mario Party, which was always a laugh with mates. Games for sale is where you might find a bargain, or maybe not. Someone's selling a GoldenEye map, which is a bit random. Pocket Game Boys, WWF Warzone, and a load of SNES games are up for grabs. Then there's the N64 stuff, like Zelda, Mission, Impossible, Mario 64, and Turok again, all the usual suspects. They're even flogging a bundle of SNES games, including Mortal Kombat and Mario Kart, for 50 quid. Seems a bit steep now, but maybe not back then. Orrington. Lastly, pen pals, people looking for mates to write to who are also into N64 games. It's all very wholesome, wanting to chat about Zelda, GoldenEye and all that. A good reminder of how you actually connected with people before the internet took over everything. It's quite sweet really, all these gamers trying to find each other in the real world through the pages of a magazine. This page delves into the often skipped game credits, suggesting they actually reveal a good bit about the folks who made these digital worlds. It's like saying, hold on, before you mash start on the next game, maybe take a peek at who actually made this thing. It's broken down into sections, starting with main programming, which rightly points out these are the clever bods who built the game's guts from scratch. They mention Shigeru Miyamoto bringing together Toshio Iwawaki and Lilac Wars developer Takemitsu Kawahara for Mario 64 and Zelda 64, which is a decent shout, those games were pretty groundbreaking back then. They also mention Bob Cohen and his merry band behind the Turok games and Aaron Seeler improving Quake 2, which is a bit random but alright. Next up is level design, talking about the folks who conjure up the game maps and dungeons. It highlights that for course designers for games like Star Wars Episode 1 Racer and V-Rally 99, they had quite a few, whereas something more complex in 3D like Glover needed even more level editors. Apparently, Miyamoto only trusted a select few, with level editing wands, naming Makoto Miyanaga as designing stages for Mario 64, Mario Kart and Zelda, meaning Tick-Tock Clock, Koopa Troopa Beach and Ganon's Castle were all from the same brain. They then mention Yoichi Yamada's level designs for Mario 64, impressed Shigs so much he got the Zelda 64 gig, and Naoki Mori also worked on Mario 64, and Mario Kart and then Zelda cutscenes. Fair play to them, some cracking levels in those games. Finally, 3D Modelers gets a look in, focusing on the folks who turn virtual plasticine into 3D worlds. It notes this area is often outsourced. They use Rare's David Wise designing the new-look Donkey Kong as an example, which is a good point that Ape was everywhere back then, wasn't he? Apparently he's in the credits of both Mario Kart 64 and Mario Party. They also mention Donkey Kong also crops up in Smash Bros, alongside name checks for Shigeru Miyamoto, Metroid designer, and Game Freak, inventors of Pikachu and Pocket Monster. It's a bit of a whirlwind tour, but it does show that there's more to those scrolling names than just filler. This page from the mag is having a look at the folks behind the games. Roll the credits, it says, so it's all about the developers. It's titled The Big Boys. Bit cheeky, that isn't it? First up is Shigeru Miyamoto, the big cheese at Nintendo. They call him the director of plethora of Nintendo games, mentioning Wave Race, Lilac Wars, Mario 64 and Zelda. Blimey, he's done alright, hasn't he? They make a point of his comedy haircut, and how his brain knows exactly what makes a world-beating game. Then there's Chris and Tim Stamper from Rare, apparently known as the Thanks Guys from Rare Games, for the programming teams. They're praised for disguising their BAA fata winning roles, and reckon they're the Miyamotos of Rare, responsible for GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie and Diddy Kong Racing. Good times, those games were proper crackers. David Deanspear from Iguana gets a shout out as creative director, dragging Acclaim out of the gutter with games like Turok, Turok 2 and South Park. They say he's got an understanding of the hardware and provided the gore on the N64. Lovely stuff. Finally, Minoru Arakawa, a Nintendo regular, works as an advisor and developers thank him, especially Rare and Acclaim, for his help making games like Twycross Magic and Sparkly. So yeah, a page celebrating the main men behind the games, the big boys indeed. This page looks at the unsung heroes of game development, the people behind the scenes that really bring these digital worlds to life. First up, it talks about the 3D animators, apparently just under the modelers in the pecking order. Always the way, isn't it? It mentions that for Zelda 64, Link's moves were actually based on motion capture from a martial arts school, the Japan Action Club. Blimey, that's dedication. They also used these JAC chaps for animating Zelda's characters, which is a bit ironic considering they were already doing Mario characters before that. Talk about covering all bases at Nintendo. Apparently Takumi Kawagoe was the camera programmer, and he was the genius behind Mario 64's camera, which they reckon is still top-notch, unlike some other N64 games where the camera was a right pain in the backside. Moving on, there's a bit about character design. Before all the polygons get pushed around, someone's got to draw the characters first. John Taylor did the bikes for Extreme G, and a chap called Matt Cooling is blamed for that dodgy-looking gremlin bird woman thing from XG2's intro, remember her? Hideous. Kevin Bayliss got a shout-out for Timber the Tiger in Diddy Kong Racing, fair enough. And Satoru Takazawa gets a mention. He did Mario's look in Mario 64, and Lilac Wars graphics, and then even helped with Link's pointy ears in Zelda 64, busy bloke. TT. Lastly, it's texture artists. Apparently texture artist is going out of fashion as a job title, becoming just part of the general artist's role, but Glover bucked that trend with a whopping 9 people just doing textures. 9! For Glover! Mind you, those gloves were pretty colourful, I suppose. And Giles Goddard is mentioned again. He did Mario's chubby face in Mario 64, and was also one of the brains behind 1080 snowboarding. They even had a little dig about reusing textures, pointing out a wall texture in Wave Race 64's. Port Blue Course looks suspiciously like the basement from Mario 64. Sneaky. This page takes a look at the people behind the games, in a section called Roll the Credits. It starts off talking about music and how Zelda 64 was good for putting the musician high up in the credits. Rightly so, as Koji Kondo is a legend, isn't he? What with Mario 64, Zelda, Star Fox 64, and loads of the older Mario games under his belt. Apparently, reusing sound artists saves developers a job, which makes sense, I suppose. Acclaim's Darren Mitchell popped up for Turok, Turok 2 and South Park, and Hideaki Shimizu did sound effects for most of Nintendo's big games. It mentions various music acts in games at the time like Rhapsody for V-Rally, Straylight in Vigilante 8, and bands like Fluke and the Propellerheads in Wipeout. Robin Beanland did the music for Killer Instinct Gold, but also managed to sneak some cheesy elevator music into GoldenEye of all things. Then it moves on to voice artists, pointing out Peach in Mario Golf, saying she's been promoted from kidnap victim to golf pro, but her voice hasn't changed. It talks about Charles Martinet being the voice of Mario, and Leslie Swan as Peach. Apparently the kids singing and chuckling in Diddy Kong Racing were by J, K and C Stamper, and C Sutherland, probably the Stampers kids, knowing those rare lads, Chris and Tim. Wipeout 64, on the old Commodore Amiga 1200, blimey, that's going back a bit, used speech synthesis for robotic voices. Next up is product testing. They call it product testing. Posh name for playtesters, really. It's about the kids who get to play games early to check they work, and Steven Stamper tested GoldenEye for his family apparently. The Super Mario Club is mentioned, Nintendo's in-house testers, and they had loads of them, but not everyone noticed the glitches, mind you. They also mention the technical assistants who know the N64 inside out, fixing problems in games like Mario 64 and Mario Kart 64, and Lilac War, which is Star Fox 64 over here. There are little bits about game credits at the bottom too. For Zelda 64, it mentions schedule management by Yoshitaka Nishikawa, and how Zelda took ages to arrive, so his schedules were a bit off, clearly. Glover had one line of code credited to Richard Alban and Tashir Rashid, who apparently didn't spend much time on it. Maybe that explains Glover then. South Park has special thanks to Erica Derry and chefs Mungo the Mold, which is a bit odd. And Gex 3D testers Casey Craig and Tony the Tiger Townsend got credited, and apparently Enter the Gecko's credits are hilarious, or not, they reckon. Diddy Kong Racing just lists special thanks to Armand Williams Jr., Erica Juarez and Rich Richardson, just because the names were a bit funny it seems, especially Eric Juarez. Yeah, alright then. This page screams late 90s N64, doesn't it? We've got a big splash about Perfect Dark coming soon in N64 Magazine. Of course it's Perfect Dark, everyone was banging on about that back then, being the proper follow-up to GoldenEye. They are really pushing the astonishing features angle, and bragging about even more new shots. Well, yeah, that's kind of what you do in a magazine, isn't it? Then down below we've got the reviews. Looks like they've taken a look at Revolt, Carmageddon 64, and Monster Truck Madness. Revolt, I remember that one. Little radio-controlled cars racing around. Looked alright for a bit of a laugh. Carmageddon 64. Well, Carmageddon was always a bit controversial, wasn't it, even on the N64. And then Monster Truck Madness, I guess, if you were into that sort of thing. Big trucks driving over stuff. Not exactly groundbreaking stuff in the review section, to be honest, but hey, it's filler for the mag, isn't it, until Perfect Dark actually arrives. The UK's best-selling, it proclaims at the bottom. Well, each to their own, I suppose. This page is for issue 33 of Planet 64 magazine back in September 99, bragging about having 140 pages packed with N64 stuff. Seems like they're really pushing the boat out with even more pics, which is always good, isn't it? They've got a bunch of games reviewed in this issue. Looks like South Park Rally, Ridge Racer 64, and Armorines, which I remember being a bit of a Doom ripoff. Then there's the new Tetris, Rugrats Scavenger Hunt, and Ogre Battle 64. Ogre Battle, that was one of those strategy RPGs if I recall correctly. Bit more niche than the others, but probably quite good for those into that sort of thing. Yee. Looking ahead to next month, they're teasing some Game Boy coverage in Planet Game Boy, with Mario Golf Pokémon and R-Type DX, and Conker's Pocket Tales. R-Type DX was a solid handheld shooter. Mario Golf on the Game Boy was decent enough if you were into golfing on the go. Betty. Then there's the usual magazine guff, promising first news. Everyone always claims that, don't they? Tons of tips and cheats. Japanese and American game reviews. Standard fare, really. New Skill Club 64. I'm the best. Loads of prizes, and the only reviews you can trust. Yeah, we've heard it all before, lads. And they're giving away free game guides with the mag for Castlevania 64 and Premier Manager 64. Castlevania 64, blimey, that was a weird one, wasn't it? Bit of a Marmite game, that. Premier Manager 64, well, if you were into footy management games on the N64, then that was your lucky day, I suppose. Warrington. It says it's on sale Monday, September 6th. Right then, back to 99 we go. This page in N64 Magazine features a look back at Pilot Wings for the N64, under the Wish You Were Here section, written by Tim Weaver. He's reminiscing about it being the first game he ever reviewed for the mag, way back when. He talks about playing it amidst the chaos of moving office and finding it surprisingly peaceful. He reckons it's still brilliant even now, a couple of years later. He struggles to explain why it's good, but he mentions the graphics were amazing for the time, full of detailed scenery and secrets. He jokes about the shambling metal man in the gyrocopter, and how it defied description but was captivating. He says there wasn't really a plot, but it was more about competition and getting licenses, unlike the SNES version which was more freeform. He talks about the relaxing feeling of flight, and how the analog stick made it even better. He seems a bit bemused that not many people bought it at the time but still thinks it's a majestic N64 game and worth checking out. Over on the right side of the page, there's an index listing all the features in issue 32. Looks like they've got previews for Carmageddon, Destruction Derby, Hercules, The Legendary Journeys, Hot Wheels, Perfect Dark, Pocket Monsters, Super Mario RPG 2, Worms Armageddon, WCW Mayhem, and WWF WrestleMania. Reviews-wise, there's Command & Conquer, F1 WGP 2, Quake 2, Resident Evil 2, Shadowman, Skill Club 64 and Stadium 2. There's also regular bits like Club 64, Dr. Kit's Game Clinic, Jet Force Gemini Future Look, Planet Game Boy, and Right You Are. Seems like a typical issue from back then, covering all sorts of games and genres. At the bottom it says this issue on sale Friday the 6th of August, and next issue on sale Monday the 6th of September, so you know when to get your hands on the next one back in 99.